Okay, we're going to start the meeting because we definitely have a quorum. Yes, 1, 2, 3, yes. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes. Yes, thank you.
Just that quorum.
Okay. Okay. Welcome to the XCAP meeting. I'm going to ask Chantal to call the roll.
Oh, that's okay. Good evening, everyone. Gregory Braille, not yet here. Oh, I think today he actually won't be here at all. Phil Burson, Tony Carrasco, and Young Cho.
If I could ask the audience to keep it down so we can take a roll. Thank you.
Megan Kahn. Larry Klein is excused. Patricia Lau is not yet here. Adine Levin, not yet here. Nadia Naik. Keith Rexall.
Here.
David Shin.
Here.
Carrie Templeton. Here. You have a quorum present.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to start with oral communication. So this is any item that is not on the agenda. And I guess before we get going with the agenda, I just wanted to announce, we are going to move number 4 up till after oral communications, assuming Ed gets here, just because Ed has to leave at some point, and we wanted to have a discussion while he's here, and then we can go with the traffic thing. So, okay, do we have anybody who wants to speak on an item not on the agenda? I see one person. Anybody else? Okay, great. You get 2 minutes. If you can come to the mic and just make sure that it's on when you start speaking. Thanks.
Yes, hi. My name is Kathy Jordan, and I wanted to make sure that to mention that I and my neighbors who are adjacent to Embarcadero Road do not want to see Churchill closed, do not want to see Palo Alto Avenue closed. I wanted to address some remarks that were made at a prior meeting that seemed to intimate that anyone who wasn't in favor of Churchill being closed or facilitating some of the things relative to Caltrain and its proposed expansion are not moving things forward. And that supposedly closing Churchill would somehow facilitate it getting people on Caltrain and address all kinds of things. I wanted to just mention that the 9,800 vehicles that cross Churchill Avenue most likely are trying to cross town because that's a vital artery through our town. And most likely if Churchill is closed, they're not going to be jumping on Caltrain to use it to get across town. They are going to be going to Embarcadero Road or Oregon Expressway to cross town. And similarly with Palo Alto Avenue, I would expect that most of that traffic, again, would be trying to get across town, across Caltrain, and would be diverted to Embarcadero Road. And those of us who live there do not appreciate the prospect of having over 10,000 vehicles potentially being added to the traffic congestion that's already there. I guess I would say we're already choking on the growth that has taken place here and the success that this area has had and the growth that has been engendered. Yet, even with that growth, in 2 of the last 3 years, Caltrain's ridership has dropped. The projections of carrying more passengers, doubling the ridership in 20 years, supposedly predicated on housing being built near Caltrain, jobs being located, extension to the downtown San Francisco Salesforce Transit Center, downtown extension to Chinatown, many things that may not occur at all.
That's your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else? Barbara? And if there's anyone else, if you could just line up so I can count how many more minutes. Thanks.
Maybe this isn't the proper forum, but I apologize for missing the last XCAP meeting. Did the eminent domain gentleman attorney speak at all about eminent domain consequences if it's sort of a secret eminent domain in the sense that one's enjoyment of their home is definitely diminished. The value of their home is diminished, even if the city isn't proactively taking part of your property. Did he speak to that at all?
Yeah, he did. He kind of mentioned what, I guess, quality of life sort of issues. So there is a piece of the video, so I recommend you go back and watch it. I did notice I taped mine on my DVR, and last week's meeting didn't tape in the usual time slot, didn't get broadcast the way the meetings usually get broadcast, so I had to go look it up on the Mid-Penn Media site, but it is posted.
It's posted on the video, but not in writing? Is that
Correct.
okay? Was there monetary compensation?
I think it's better that you watch the video because I would never attempt to summarize what a lawyer says.
Well, we'll be hiring our own, you can count on it.
Okay, seeing no more comments, we will move to item 4 first before we hear from Hexagon so that we can take advantage of Ed's presence while he's here. So we're going to talk about the follow-up discussion regarding the XCAP work plan. Ed, is there anything you wanted to lead with, or you just wanted to discuss it?
Sorry, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Sure. So this item is a follow-up actually from the last 2 meetings where a version of the work plan was shared, and Nadia and Larry have been working with staff to update that. So we don't have an updated copy yet to share with the group, but we will soon. And we figured this would be a good opportunity to talk about the report itself and just really start trying to think about some framing of what will be included in the report. And yeah, that's where we had some ideas as staff as well, and just wanted to make sure that the XCAP really started to outline what you wanted in your final report so that we can all have clarity on where you're trying to get to once your decision is made.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, thank you, Chantel, for framing it. Nadia had given us earlier today a request for some assistance with writing sections, and I think we could be most helpful in that if we had a sense of what the overall outline, basically the table of contents, if that were a way to describe it, would be laid out, and in so doing, help you, basically. So that was the lead-in I
Great.
wanted to suggest. And to my knowledge, I don't know that the XCAP has had a conversation about how that report will be structured, and so wanted to make sure that that was on your radar screen.
Great, yeah, and so I can offer, I went back and watched the council meeting on the 21st or 22nd, whatever date that was, when we got feedback from the council members about ideas that they had of how the report might be structured. I think the one who gave the most specific thoughts was Allison Cormack, and she outlined that in her mind, the report should be basically something that someone could pick up and understand. She said the problem or the need, why we're doing this, the methods used to understand the alternatives, criteria, pros and cons, the actual recommendations, mitigations for known concerns, and any appendices and data and visualizations. So that was sort of the outline that she laid out. In talking to Larry, the parts that we were hoping that staff, the idea is that we should start writing now because there's parts of the report that will not change no matter what our recommendations are, like an introduction, what are we doing? And so the parts that we thought that staff could help us with is basically laying out the problem and need stuff, which we've discussed before. It's kind of recycling things that have been in previous staff reports, kind of about the founding of XCAP, about the direction that the council has taken. And the second section was help in just collecting the information that we've had thus far from AECOM and the Santa Clara Valley Water District, sort of a brief description of the creeks and the groundwater situation and what happens there. And the third part that Larry and I differed on, but I would love to hear from fellow XCAP members, is discussing funding. My feeling is I don't want to touch the business tax conversation with a 10-foot pole, but I did want to incorporate for CAP members. I realized later that because Larry joined us as an XCAP, he didn't see the AECOM presentations that we've seen previously about how transportation projects get financed at a federal level and kind of those alternatives. And I thought that if I was a resident who was reading this and trying to understand what we're doing, they would want to understand where does this money come from? Because from the average person, you don't buy a really expensive car if you don't have the money. That's not the way transportation projects work. You sort of define the transportation project that you need and then you go beg for the money. And so basically explaining that at a high level. I think to summarize what I think Larry's perspective is, and you can feel free if you understood differently from the short email that we got, but his thinking was, well, we haven't been asked by council to look at financing. The only thing I would point out is that our measurable criteria has a part that says, help me with the wording, it's feasible with funding sources, what is it? It's like an all word F words. That's all I remember every time. Not for, it's not foreseeable, but I'm sure Chantal will pull it up.
Feasible,
Yeah.
it's definitely feasible funding sources.
Feasible funding sources in some order in that way, right? So we literally have a criteria that says, and of course, what is feasible? What are the funding sources? That's the part that's sort of unbound. So.
Finance with feasible funding
Finance
sources.
with feasible funding sources. That's a lot of Fs. So would love to hear if you guys think that those sections sort of make sense. Is there a section that you think we're missing? And certainly if you have thoughts about whether we should talk about how funding works for transportation projects so that if someone's reading this, could understand that, or if you think we should have a narrow focus, I would love to hear from you guys. So why don't we start this way? Megan, do you have thoughts and we can kind of go around?
I think it's in the criteria, so I think we need to mention it. Digging into what types of available funding sources there are, I don't know if we need to go that far.
I'm in the same boat as Larry. I don't know that information, so I think at least an overview of what's available would be useful. And I think would help the council too, just to remind them all the different options and what we have to do, what hoops we have to jump through to get those options.
I guess the comment I had was a little bit on how to do it more so, and it's more about, like, let's say we want to summarize information from that AECOM presentation on financing. Could we just literally put those PowerPoint slides into the report, or do we need to write a paraphrasing of it? And it would seem like some of this stuff has already been generated, but it's sitting in PowerPoint format.
Right.
Could we literally just put it in there, because it would save us a ton of time rather than somebody typing words from them.
So Larry's stated goal was that somebody should be able to read all of the words and never have to look in an appendix to understand what we're doing. And so I think for the average person, having something in words that isn't understanding a PowerPoint might be helpful, because I think there's visual learners and there's kind of more word-focused people. And some of those, if you don't read the charts correctly, you might miss a detail. But that's just my own, I don't know, I'm a highly visual person, so I probably would think in PowerPoint, but I think there's people who are more word-focused, and that was kind of the concept. But do you think that, because you, Dave, at least saw those presentations, do you feel like that's definitely something that needs to be in there, given the criteria that we have, and at least how to explain to the rest of Palo Alto why we're doing this?
I'm thinking about how much time it would take to assemble this thing and how much time we have left. And so it would seem like if we can save time anywhere, then we should just use what we have and just put it in there. If we have to expand upon something, then let's do it. But maybe what we need to do is prioritize and figure out what has to go in there, and then anything else that kind of gets left over, if it needs to be shortcut by putting the PowerPoint in there, and let's put it in that way. Mm-hmm. Or if we have time, then we can keep writing more. But some of the stuff's like intro and definitions and stuff, maybe we could save time by just pointing to a PowerPoint. Now, I will also say that probably some of the PowerPoints require more text, because some people tend to put up a picture and then they talk a lot about it and they don't really write the words down. So it may require some of that anyway.
So this might be a good place for me to interject, just to clarify. My reason for suggesting that the XCAP talk about this is that you need to talk about it. I think this is an XCAP product, and quite frankly, there will be attention. Well, there already is attention as to whether you expect the staff to draft this, because quite frankly, this has got to be the XCAP's deliverable, not one from staff. We're happy to make available all the electronic soft versions of prior reports, presentations, what have you, that allow it to be most efficient in terms of generating. But this does need to reflect the XCAP's perspective. And in fact, the discussion we had several meetings ago about the problem statement, I think would be a perfect example of, if staff were to take our crack at it, you're going to rework it completely. So we need to have it be in a format and set the expectation as to how XCAP wants to structure this deliverable. And I think that, David's point of thinking about the overall product and then prioritizing what goes into it would be time well spent either by the XCAP as a whole, or if you wanted to have a small group take a crack at it and then bring it back to the full group for a read, however you'd like to approach it. I think using the groundwater, stormwater, creeks issue as an example, I had previously suggested, you've talked about it and might bear having a discussion of how that applies for each of the different alternatives. And the previous response was, no, you don't think we really need to get into it. So, we're left kind of wondering how much depth you want to get into in each of these topic areas, as well as how to structure the write-up and what the write-up will actually be. And, can't quite frankly read your mind on that.
Yep. Tony?
So I've forgotten what the question is, but I agree. I'll answer it the way you phrased it. I think that, like Megan, it's one of our criteria, and I think we should leave it there, although there is a finance committee that's going to look at it in more detail than we are. Mm-hmm. But it's relevant for us to understand it. And the other issue that you mentioned about tying it to a business tax, I would leave that out of our responsibility because
right.
I think it's a can of worms and it
Yes,
probably won't pass.
Mm-hmm. Tony, do you have any thoughts on the different sections or additional, the segments that we discussed?
I think the segments that you discussed were very well done, especially the one that Allison alluded to. Mm-hmm. And I think our report in that format would be clear. But I also agree with Ed about how much detail are we going into and the task that's ahead of us that's enormous, yeah.
Okay. Phil?
Well, I've been struggling with this question because it seems there are two audiences, or potentially two audiences. One is the council, and the other is history. And for history, we could write a master's thesis. I don't think the council will sit for reading this much. So whatever could be put into an appendix, whatever could be summarized really quickly in one or two paragraphs and see the appendix, that would be the style of writing I would like to advocate, except for the actual alternatives and the discussion of the pros and cons. But the background material, such as finance, for example, that should be in the appendix primarily. Also, I think Dave's point is right. We have to prioritize. We simply may not have enough time or arms and legs to get everything we want to write, especially for the history audience. We'll leave it to future grad students to write that. By the way, I once did a history master's thesis on the description, on the evolution of the Second Avenue subway in New York. By reading,
Are you volunteering to do our?
No. But I want
Did you hear it? I heard it.
No, I want to say I read many years of New York Times microfilms and wrote 60 pages. I don't want to do that.
I can give you a
again.
whole bunch of PowerPoints.
I don't want to do that again.
Okay. Well, so from what Ed just articulated, it seems then we'll have to think about how to break up into groups and be able to write several sections. So my next question then is, do we have any volunteers on the various sections based on what we just talked about? Because that's what it's going to take to get it done. And if there's a section that you're passionate about, or if we're going to break up according to the working groups, and then maybe think about working backwards.
I think without seeing the list of sections in front of us or agreeing upon them, it's hard to say.
Great. So how about I get something to you guys based on the sections that Allison brought up and what we just discussed, and then we'll put that next to the list of kind of committees that we had, sort of working groups that we had previously on topics, and then we can see how that filters out. I think the other part that's going to be challenging is figuring out how we co-edit all of those sections, because that's going to be fun. Yeah, so we'll have to figure out how that goes. But
That could be a subgroup potentially as well.
yeah, it could be a subgroup, and then the committee has to bring that forward.
I had two questions related to the report. One was, are there examples that we can use of reports of a similar type that were successful? And also, who's the primary audience? Is the primary audience the city council members? So it should look like a staff report that we get in our email inbox that we click on, or it should look more like the comprehensive plan where the audience is a little bit more the entire city and history.
Well, I think you heard Ed say that it's up to us what we want it to look like. So the question is, what do you think it should look like?
Councilmember Cormack, in giving some of the outline, was thinking of some of the work that the library, I think it was the library bond or something, from some years ago, so that could be a potential example.
I think we are reporting to council, and we have to assume that they are knowledgeable about this project, so I don't think we need to go really deep. I think if staff wants to take it further to explain it to the public, they should take that report and take it over.
Okay, anybody else?
I want to agree with Tony completely here.
Okay.
Would it be completely unprofessional to do it completely in PowerPoint? Because I'm like you. I'm a PowerPoint person. And it would be so much faster and more efficient, and we can add graphics in there.
So Dave, let me speak to that.
Very detailed PowerPoints.
Yeah, let me, having done my share of all that stuff, PowerPoint can be abused, and this expression, death by PowerPoint. In fact, good PowerPoint, one practice is not to put a lot of information, but primarily to use them as talking points, really. That doesn't translate well to audiences that didn't attend the presentation. Second, it is entirely possible to drag and drop complicated graphics into a Word doc. Microsoft Office is very uniform and very powerful that way.
I'm still hearing you volunteered. In my head, that's what I hear.
All right, we can talk about
I'm
that.
giving you a hard time, Phil. I don't
That's
mean
okay, I
don't
can give you a
mean to
hard
put you on
time
the
right
spot.
back. And that's for history.
Anybody else? Keith, did you have thoughts?
This is just our recommendation to council, and they may look at it and say, no, we're not listening to you. So I don't think we have to go down into the nitty-gritty, but we have to communicate what we're thinking to council.
Mm-hmm.
And that assumes that they have some standard knowledge that we don't have to fill them in.
Yeah, I think what we have to do is assume that they, without trying to in any way cast aspersion, we have to assume they don't have enough time on their own to go through these issues. So we have to assume a very superficial baseline level of knowledge, maybe one or two council have more than that, and then take them down the thought process to in effect say, this is why we're recommending this. Walk them through the thought process, what we thought about, why we thought about it, and say, this is why we are recommending what we are. And of course, the criteria are a very key part of that. And the rest is up to history, which historians will write. Grad students, yes.
Well, so for those of you who are interested, at about the 4-hour and 4-minute mark on that council meeting, which was, I think, January 21st or 22nd, that's where the council comments begin. So if you wanted to go back and watch that, because I think I heard, Allison mentioned these sections, but she sort of talked about, if any Palo Alton picked up the report and wanted to know, well, why are we doing this, and what is this thing, and how did you decide what you decided, that they should be able to understand it. So I think, at least from what I heard Allison say, it seems that she's not just thinking, hey, you need to convince the 7 of us. I think you also need to convince your fellow Palo Altons, because at some point, somebody who lives in a neighborhood that is not next to the tracks is going to read this and be like, they're doing what? What is this thing? And so we'll have to think about how to, we may have to have some very basic, what is a grade crossing, right? Because not everyone gets it.
Appendix,
Yes, appendix.
glossary,
Yep.
links.
You've got so many ideas.
With our schedule, I suspect what's going to happen is we're going to be pressed by time, and we're just going to,
Yeah.
things are going to drop off the plate. And if the council really needs that, then we go back and we work after we do our recommendation. But unless we want to slip the schedule, I don't think, we will be limiting ourselves.
Yep.
Or maybe the appendix comes in the sequel, like part 2 or.
Sharknado. Carrie, yeah.
What, if any, part of this document will staff be contributing to?
It's a good question. We need to get a sense of the document in order for us to be able to help you with that.
Especially concerning since we can't do a collaborative document, it may be better for,
Yeah, I think that was the,
yeah.
I'm not sure I follow the why you can't do a collaborative document.
Please
Brown
inform
Act?
us if we can do a collaborative Google
I think
Doc
you
in
can-
the Brown Act.
Absolutely. You know, ultimately, well, I think you're talking about having small groups responsible for sections that are then assembled, which is fine.
I think if you had one document and everyone could comment in it, does that become a problem?
I think if it's public, that's still a question, because if everyone can see it, then it isn't a
We
closed.
may need
Right, it's
Molly
fine.
to confirm for us if we did a big Google Doc for which there was a public link, but you'd have the 12 of us on it and you could see all of us commenting, is that acceptable?
I suggest you have at it, and we'll confirm it with Molly, but, you know, this meeting can and should be the opportunity for feedback on the document. There'll be drafts, and that's the nature of what we've got next week coming on the city council report on boards and commissions, so they have less than a quorum that contributes to the document, and then it's shared and discussed in open. It's fine.
Okay. Okay.
If we can't have all of us on one Google document, then I think a lot of what makes this challenging with the time, with our timeline goes away. So maybe it's not illegal, Dave.
I like it.
So, I mean, just to be clear, what we're, hopefully, maybe Nadia or Chantal can talk to Molly about, but the proposal is there is a public link where they can view, and then any members of the committee can edit. And then,
I think let's figure out by next week when we look at what groups we're in, right? Because we might want to have first, as Ed sort of said, different groups doing different sections, and then we'll kind of put it together, and then we can all go through and kind of revise.
Sounds
Because
good.
12 cooks in the kitchen will be complicated, right? And we might want to do a subcommittee who's the people who like to write. And then, I'm looking at you, yeah. I'm teasing you.
I've done a lot of writing.
And then, we can work from there. So, and then, talking about the work plan also for next week, I know that Larry mentioned it the week before, but starting on the 26th, so we don't have a meeting next week, nobody come. I know every Wednesday, you're on the edge of your seat here, but the following week, we will actually start deliberating. And by deliberating, we mean we're going to start to at least go around the room and have each of us kind of talk about where we are, how are we feeling about what we've got, do we have any big holes, kind of a check-in. So I don't want anyone to be surprised when that happens in 2 weeks, but we're getting to the good stuff. So, does anybody else have anything that they wanted to add or discuss in terms of the work plan? Ed and Chantal, is that?
No.
Okay. All right, great. Do we have anyone from the audience who wants to speak on this topic in public comment? Okay, seeing none, we can now move to agenda item number 3, which is follow-up discussion with Hexagon regarding the traffic study. And we've got Gary Black and Millette and Peter DiStefano.
Thank you. So there's a handout here that hopefully everyone has that has the questions. And these are the questions that Chantal summarized. And so we provided answers to these questions. And for each question, there's just an answer under it. Whoa. And there's also we prepared a PowerPoint, but there's nothing in the PowerPoint that's not in the handout. So the PowerPoint, I mean, we'll show some of the slides just so you can either look at the handout or look at the screen, whatever's easier. So I'm just going to go through these, and I don't have any ideas of format. You can interrupt me anytime. I guess it's up to you what you want to do. Or do you want to go through all of them and then have questions? Or
We may need to go through them because we didn't see these ahead of time. So,
Yeah, if we could get them earlier, well, I don't know if we have further meetings will be necessary, hopefully not, but, yeah, getting these things a little bit, even if it's hours before Chantal, would be really helpful so we can check our email and sort of give it a glance before we get here. Thank you.
yeah, because it's a lot of pages. Yep,
But
okay.
we're going to go through each one. So
Okay.
I'm not just going to, hit the highlights. So I thought we'd just go through each one.
Great.
So the first question was about access to the properties on Kingsley with kind of the new signal at Kingsley, and there was an idea of maybe adding a lane to provide access to the properties. And so we thought, we're getting a lot of questions about this, and it is a good question about how can you maintain access. So we went ahead and actually drew a design. Let's find that here on the PowerPoint. Okay. Yeah, that looks pretty big. Or you can look at your handout. So, so this time we came up with an actual conceptual drawing. What you were seeing before was kind of just a sketch. And this shows that along the bottom edge, I don't have a pointer, but anyway, of the drawing.
Yeah, it doesn't work on screen.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it does. Look, there's the pointer.
Oh, is it?
Oh, so Phil is showing where the driveways, whoops, it went away. So there's driveways along here. There's a driveway, and there's driveway. This doesn't work very well. Anyway, you see the driveways along there. And so with this concept design, that curb line stays exactly the way it is today. So the driveways would have the same access that they have now. And, well, you can see the signal operates the left turns, it doesn't operate the right turn. If there's, additional questions about that, I guess we can go into more detail, but.
Just one quick one. That was my question.
Yeah.
So you don't think there's a risk of that right turn lane filling up ever? You think it'll empty out effectively because there's no light at the end of it onto Embarcadero? Effectively, potentially blocking those driveways at any point?
Well, there would be times when, there'd be cars waiting at the stop sign, and so they would have to wait for the cars to get out of the way. But we did a simulation of this, and it's not a standing queue, so there wouldn't be, constantly a line of cars there all the time to make it so that people couldn't get in and out of the driveways during certain hours. It kind of comes and goes. Next question, can you have two-way cycle track on both sides of Embarcadero east of the underpass? This actually is east of the underpass, so this is the same area. The concept that we're thinking of now is that there would be one-way cycle tracks, one on each side. There isn't enough room without taking right-of-way to have two-way cycle tracks on both sides.
Right, I guess the concern there was that unless you add a crosswalk, I know maybe this drawing doesn't have one, that the people using that bike and pedestrian underpass on both sides currently don't switch to the correct side of the road so that only people going west in the direction of car traffic are using, the northern side of Embarcadero, and only people going east are using the southern.
Well, they're, yeah, understood. And I'm not prepared to, discuss what ifs. All I'm saying is that they wouldn't fit within the existing right-of-way. Now, if the XCAP said we want it, and so design something, then, we could see what we could come up with.
Right. I would be in favor of that. Ex-cappers.
Okay. Let's see. Then the question is, would the new light at Kingsley result in the need to acquire properties? And no, the design does not anticipate the acquisition of any right-of-way or any properties. Could a right turn lane be added to Embarcadero heading west on El Camino at the light at El Camino? So let's find that drawing here. So this is the drawing that we have now for El Camino, and it has two left turns and a through, and then a shared through and right. I think this is where the comment's talking about, a right turn lane from Embarcadero to El Camino. And there really wouldn't be room to add a right turn lane and a second left turn lane. Right now, there's just one left turn lane. that's kind of an either-or. The only thing I'd like to point out about the right turn lane is that it's not shown on this diagram, but I believe the concept is to have a cycle track on Embarcadero on both sides. And if you had a cycle track, it would be to the right of all the cars. But if you introduced a right turn lane, then you would have to put the bikes out into the street. Because my design opinion, others might disagree, I don't want to see bikes on the right-hand side of a right turn lane. So I want to see bikes on the other side of a right turn lane. So you would need to transition the lane, your cycle track, out into the street as a striped bike lane that would be between the through lanes and the right turn lane. So it's definitely.
Or a bicycle light, like in San Francisco.
Well, there's other ways to design it. So I guess the bottom line is, yes, it's possible to do that, but it would be a trade-off with the double left. So if this ends up being pursued, we're kind of way on the front end here, and there would be a lot more design work that would go into that intersection.
And the goals of the double left were that's a high volume turn.
It's about the same volume as the right turn right now, but we're anticipating that this is with Churchill being closed. So that would add traffic to that left turn.
Gary, is there an impact from, just staying on this diagram, now because Churchill is closed in this picture, would you have more people on El Camino going south trying to make a left turn onto Embarcadero? And if
Yes.
I'm looking at this diagram, it's only one lane. Would we add a second left turn lane
You
there?
could add a second left turn lane, yeah.
Because one of the things that was discussed previously is the cars stack up there to make that left turn, but there's also an ability to make a left turn into Town and Country, and there's a conflict that happens right in that zone. And so people, they're not sure which lane they're getting into, and then what happens is you have a lot of people who go even when they're going to be sticking out into the intersection, and then ends up backing the northbound El Camino traffic. And so I'm wondering if that'll only get worse once Churchill closes and more people are now turning onto Embarcadero.
That's correct. All I can say is that El Camino's wide enough to put another lane on.
But you didn't deem that something that was necessary as part of the mitigation of a closure?
We didn't, but as I said, there's a lot of ways to look at El Camino and Embarcadero. You could add the second left, like we showed here. You could add a second left, like you just described, on El Camino. You could add a right turn instead, going from Embarcadero to El Camino. And I think that we'd have to, check the numbers, but I think any of those improvements would probably help offset the added traffic from the Churchill closure.
Okay.
So there's a lot of options here at this intersection.
So what I'm hearing you say is if a Churchill closure was adopted, then a deeper study of what are the actual improvements would be needed.
Absolutely, at this intersection, absolutely.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's not just what you've thought of, there could be different ones.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Can you confirm that the ramp southbound from Oregon to Alma misses the light? Yes. So, this one's a little hard to see, isn't it? Where's my little mouse? My little pointer. My little pointer.
You have to look on the screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Where did it go? Here, maybe it's faster.
Wait,
Here.
it's in the middle now.
That's this ramp right here. So here's the signal, here's the stop line, this ramp hits off here. So it would not be controlled by the signal, it's over here. Like that.
So I think
that answers the question.
I think the concern or the reason for the question was that if you had 3 or 4 cars stopped at that light in the far right southbound lane, you would be impeding those that are a constant go down to the Cal Ave area. In other words, yeah, if cars are stacking right in that lane, by the 3rd or 4th car, you now wouldn't have an all go below.
I actually meant, it's hard to describe this intersection, but I actually meant, I'll just point to it.
Yeah. Oh, that one. No, that one wouldn't be controlled by the light. That's separate, that's off to the side.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I was
But-
concerned about queuing backing up Oregon
Yeah,
itself.
but I think,
That ramp is lower, right? It's as you come off Oregon.
Yeah,
It's climbing
curly
up.
Q.
So,
Traffic lights at street level.
but I think to answer Nadia's concern, yes, if you had a few cars backed up at that signal, then it would temporarily block that ramp until the light turned green, and then they could access the ramp.
Okay.
But that was not shown to be a big problem in the analysis, in the overall scheme of things. Let's see, where are we? The traffic simulation is modeled peak hours using Caltrain numbers. However, Caltrain intends to expand their service so there'd be more trains during what we call the off-peak hours. And we focused on the peak hours because there's when the combination of trains and cars is the highest. So during the off-peak hours, the car count isn't that high. So if we can make things work during the car peak, which is also the Caltrain peak, then we can for sure make things work during the off-peak, even if there's more Caltrains. So that's the quick answer.
And just to confirm, you used 12 trains per hour, not 16.
12, correct.
Okay.
Not 16.
And I guess a further question is going to be about the 16.
Yes,
right?
we're coming to
Yes,
that.
perfect.
There is a question about that. But I'm going to go in order instead of jumping around. Okay, why did Hexagon disagree with the previous consultant that there would not be impacts on Middlefield and Embarcadero? Well, we took a look at the streetlight data that shows the origin and destination of traffic that's using Churchill and going across the railroad tracks. And, Churchill actually ends before you get to Middlefield. So the streetlight data showed that most of the traffic, other than the traffic on Alma, but all the other traffic that's using Churchill is coming from that little triangle neighborhood there. And so if it's closed, we didn't think that the traffic you would sort of have to backtrack to use Middlefield. You'd have to go away from Alma, then use Middlefield, make a left turn, and then come back towards Alma. So you can, I guess all of you in your minds can say, is that a reasonable assumption or not? But we assigned that traffic to use Waverly, where there's also a signal. And so it would use Waverly to get to Embarcadero. That Waverly and Embarcadero intersection is not that bad, so there would not be an impact at that location. What would a viaduct do to traffic in the Churchill area, and how could any potential inducement be mitigated? So we had to really put on our thinking caps on this one to try to get at what the question is trying to address. I think the idea is that, and you can correct me whoever wrote this question, can correct me if I'm wrong, the idea is that if we make it a lot easier to use Churchill, then maybe more traffic will use Churchill. Is that the idea? Yeah. So we would expect, a little more traffic to use Churchill, quite frankly, but mostly between Alma and El Camino, not so much within the neighborhood, because it appears that the traffic coming out of the neighborhood, it's not that much compared to the amount of traffic that's using the part of Churchill between Alma and El Camino. So if you look at the counts at Churchill, you see a lot of traffic coming down Alma turning right. You see a lot of traffic turning left on Alma to Churchill, but you don't see, there's not very much traffic that's coming out of the neighborhood or going into the neighborhood. And we have a count later which we can look at, trying to dig deeper into that. And the other thing is with the viaduct, the signal's still going to be there. So it's not like you're going to have free flow. And in fact, when we look a little farther, you'll see that with the viaduct, the operation of that intersection is still not wonderful, I guess. Because what that does is take out the train interruptions. But there's still a lot of traffic on Alma and making turns onto Churchill, and that needs to be accommodated. So
I think one of the concerns the neighbors had were, one reason that people don't take Churchill right now is because of the train. And so they might be going down Embarcadero now because they don't want the prospect of having to stop for the train. But now if that effect isn't there anymore, they may be more induced to go to Churchill, and Churchill may now get even more traffic than it does today. So the question is one is, can we calculate how much increased traffic that would have? And number two, if there is increased traffic, what kind of mitigations could we do to make it go back to where it is today?
We can do a little deeper dive. I mean, so far all I did was look at the traffic and say, it's not going to be a whole lot more, because the operation of the intersection is not going to be a whole lot better than it is now, and so it wouldn't be a tremendous inducement. But we could, dig deeper on that one and come up with a number. And in terms of what you would do about it to discourage the traffic from using Churchill, I think there's, it's already a pretty narrow street and it has bike lanes. So, but I think the city is separately pursuing perhaps some, what we would call traffic calming potential improvements on Churchill that would slow the traffic down. And when you slow traffic down, that's when, people decide, I'm not going to bother because it takes too long. So that's the way so we're not talking about closing it off, at least to my knowledge, but to try to slow it down, to make it less attractive.
Would that be things like speed bumps, or are there other options?
There's other options. You could always do speed bumps, but I don't know if that would be advocated by people who live there. But I was thinking more of what we call bulb outs, where you make the street look narrow, or, maybe plant some trees on it or something, make the street look super narrow. Chantel's looking at me like I'm from Mars. Hopefully I'm not saying anything out of turn here. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, if I could step in, we could have a whole toolbox of items that could be used in order to achieve that.
Okay. So you think, bottom line is, if this does induce people to use Churchill, there are ways to rectify that?
Yeah.
There's a difference in
correct.
inducing, I think I perceive a difference in the increase of cars between El Camino and Alma, and just more people turning now onto Alma because that's more efficient, even though I get that it's not significantly more efficient, but not having a train makes it way more significant in the current situation. And then there's a difference between the cut through of those who might choose now to go further into Old Palo Alto across, something they don't do now, to kind of cut further down. And that could be, there's different things that you could deter in different ways using things in Philip's toolbox.
Yeah, and if we're directed to, we could, like I say, we could dive deeper on this. It's a little bit speculative, so you would have to kind of have an asterisk by it. So, anyway,
A quick comment?
Yeah.
Just one last one. So what concerns me is when you said there will be a little bit more induced traffic, except that already during those times, and yes, I understand that there's a train going through, but there's cars already backed up, like from, say, Alma all the way up to El Camino, like nearly all the way to the end. And also, it is also similar on the other side too, depending on the time of day. And so a little bit more would mean yet another one or two cars, which on that short street would mean it would be even more full. So that's concerning to me. So I guess my question is could the traffic lights or some other thing be manipulated such that you could empty that out as much as possible? Or is that backup is?
Yeah, we're talking about traffic volume and not queuing. Without the train interruption, you would see the queuing, largely disappear. Not entirely, but we could calculate. We already have looked at how much it would be decreased, but I'm not prepared to say what that number is because I don't have it with me. But a lot of the reason for the queuing is because of the train interruptions, and then Churchill can't go when the train comes. Alma gets a green, so you've got plenty of green time on Alma, but not on Churchill. But if the train is gone, then that intersection can operate in a more, balanced fashion, and maybe you'll get longer, maybe a little queuing on Alma, and you'll trade that off for a lot reduced queue on Churchill. So the queue length and the volume are two different things. But I definitely would not think that the queue is going to get any longer if you get rid of the train interruptions. It'll get
Yeah, and
short-
we
it'll get
did
shorter.
those Q-length graphics for those. We even have them on the fact sheet for the Churchill closure.
But
So
that
it gives
doesn't show
sense.
the queue length with the viaduct, where the train's gone. We didn't.
Oh,
we
you didn't do that for that one.
We did, but we haven't produced any diagrams or anything. So we can look more at that too, if you,
That'd be helpful.
okay. Our list is, yeah.
So I take it Q1, the graphic on Q1 supersedes the graphic on Q work request 4. In other words, this is a new and improved version of the intersection you showed us earlier, or is it an alternative?
This one? Are you talking about this that's on the
Yeah.
screen now?
Yeah. Is that an upgraded version of the last alternative
Yes,
that you showed us?
yes. I wouldn't necessarily say it's upgraded more than, well, I'll get to that in a minute. It is different, which we'll see in a minute as we go through these questions. But mostly we drew this to try to answer the question about driveway access.
I see.
And is it
Okay.
still feasible?
Okay.
Okay, where we were. Similar question for Mike Price's idea at Churchill. How would it impact traffic flow and how would inducement be mitigated? Well, on Mike Price's idea, you can't go across on Churchill. So there would be probably increased volume on Churchill between El Camino and Alma with that one, because it would be a lot easier to do than it is now. But there wouldn't, the volume on Churchill, on the other part of Churchill, the residential part of Churchill, would be reduced because you couldn't go straight or turn left. You could only turn right. So the volume on that part of Churchill would be reduced. The volume on the part of Churchill over by El Camino would be increased. Again, we could take a stab at calculating how much it would be increased.
Would you say that given the amount of, since cross-traffic is not the biggest chunk, would that now diverted traffic, let's say it goes on Embarcadero, would that then require mitigations on Embarcadero given the numbers that we've seen in the traffic study?
Excellent question, because that's the next one.
Oh.
And so yes, with Mike Price's idea, there would be some diversion. There wouldn't be as much diversion as you would get with closure, because you could still make a right turn out of there. You just couldn't go across, but going across is not a big movement. It's fairly low. It's like 50 cars in the peak hour or something, in each direction, something like that. And so if I would say, it's in our scope of work, and this is jumping ahead because you had a question specifically about that. It's in our scope of work to study that diversion if Mike Price's idea gets advanced. So far, we've held off doing that, just to kind of save ourselves time and and effort if it turns out that idea is not pursued. But yes, there would be some diversion. Again, I don't think there would be really induced traffic onto Embarcadero. Induced traffic onto Churchill. Can trucks and buses turn on Kingsley? Yes. And this turning template was put on a slightly different version of the question 1 design. So this is something that's evolving based on your questions. But this shows a typical truck, we call wheelbase 40 truck, making the turn. So yes, it could make the turn. It seems very tight. Well, it has to be designed so a truck can make the turn. Emergency vehicles also need to use the road, so they also need to make the turn. It's not an option to design something that an emergency vehicle would not be able to negotiate. So I think we have to design it like this so the truck can turn. Was the LOS of the new Kingsley light in 2030? So we have, if you're following along, though I think I put it on the screen too, if you really want to look there. So here's the level of service existing and future with the light at Kingsley with a new signal. And here's where I'm kind of getting into the discussion of that particular intersection of Kingsley and Embarcadero. That this shows under 2030 in the PM, that intersection would operate at level service E, which is not really good. We'd like it to be better than that. And also, you had questions about the queuing. And so I will say that the XCAP questions, your questions, are causing us to dig deeper on some of these issues and come up with some revisions. Because when we looked at the simulation with that light, the backup on Embarcadero in the PM went almost to El Camino. So it was really long. And we said, well, we really don't know that that's going to be palatable, especially since we haven't simulated Embarcadero itself, which is another one of your questions. So let's look at some of these. Maybe I can illustrate this with these drawings. So let's look at this one with the truck turning on it. And you can see, let me just point. There's a left turn lane here. That was a design you saw before. Okay. That left turn lane opposes the through traffic on Embarcadero going east in the PM peak, which is a heavy movement, and there's only one lane for that movement. So that was causing the level service E in the backup. So we drew the new version, which we'll see if it's palatable. So this is the new version, and when I say new, I mean these things were drawn like 2 hours before this meeting. I mean, everything that we're doing here is going 100 miles an hour because of your schedule.
We can put speed bumps on for you.
We appreciate it.
So in this one, that left turn is gone, and so in order to turn left, you need to use the Embarcadero slip ramp, and then there would be another signal up at Alma, which is one of the concepts that you saw earlier. And then we said, well, maybe we don't need that, and we can just put this left turn lane here and not use that slip ramp. But in the 2030, if we believe the forecasts, it doesn't look like it's going to work really well to have the left turn here. And Ed's frowning because he's never seen this before. I mean, this is literally like 2 hours ago, so.
In 2030, having the left lane be done using the slip road would not work?
No, this would work.
This would work, or the other way?
Yeah, it's the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Hey, question.
I'm going pretty fast here, but we have a lot of things, so I don't know. Do you want to ask a question about this one?
I was just curious about, in the 2030 scenario, would adding another lane go under Embarcadero, under Alma, alleviate any of that, or no?
Yes, it would. But we didn't pursue that at this point because that's a major deal.
Yeah, replacement of the bridge.
It's replacing, I mean, there's columns and retaining walls and there's all kinds of stuff under there. So I'm sure any of the designers here would be happy to redesign this interchange if city told us, hey, let's just tear it down and start over again. Let's continue on. I think the next, where was I, on 11? The next question I didn't understand, so I don't know if we want to come back to it at the end, if we want to try to talk about it now, but there's a question, do we have a way to measure pedestrian connectivity? Do any metrics exist?
Yeah, because that was just related to some of our work to try to use things like the delay numbers that you've given us to measure the different options. And we can sort of understand there's like levels of safety or types of bike lanes and that type of thing that we can measure, but we were wondering if there was a way to measure, can I get from, where that speed bump is to Pally, and how long does that take me? Does that make sense? As a pedestrian, I mean.
Yes. Well, we could better mark out the pedestrian paths that would be involved. If you would define and say, well, here's the pedestrian movements I'm interested in, and show us how those would be accomplished and how long it would take. The question was open-ended, so you didn't really know where you're talking about. But if you were to define that better, we definitely could. We could draw the pedestrian paths onto any diagram that you wanted and then calculate how long it would take to do that as a pedestrian, how long it would take to walk. And I think maybe one question that you might have is, well, how long is it going to take me to cross Alma? Because in order to use, say, the pedestrian bridge, you have to first get across Alma. So, am I really saving any time, or is it only safety? Those kind of questions. So,
the criteria that we have says provide clear, safe routes for pedestrians and cyclists crossing the rail corridor separate from vehicles. And so that's what we're supposed to measure against, and it's not very useful because we don't know that any such metrics exist, hence Megan's question.
That's a design, to me, that's a design goal. So design a path. Not how long is it going to take me, but design a path to do this. It's separated from vehicles to the extent feasible, I guess. So let's just kind of, if you'd like to better define that, we can provide some information, some input on that.
Gary, I'd support what Megan just said. I think it's important, and I think that you've done a really good job very quickly. But I think it addresses cars, but I think now we need to layer on the pedestrians and bikes and make it almost more important than the cars, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I will say that all the designs that you've seen have accommodated bikes and pedestrians. It's just that we don't highlight it on the drawings. So I appreciate your comment that we need to highlight how that's been accommodated, but we haven't designed anything that would preclude bikes and pedestrians to be unsafe or uncomfortable or anything.
Well, and if the group agrees, perhaps we could provide you with some routes and say, like, is this still possible effectively?
So what I'm struggling with is, ultimately, we're trying to decide, do you close Churchill, or do you build a viaduct, or do you do Mike Price's idea? And then once you've decided that, you then would go into, okay, we definitely are deciding we're doing a closure, for example, but now we really want to focus on what the mitigations are. And so I think that's what Gary's saying is if you've decided on a closure, he's going to have to go back and do a heck of a lot more work to be able to get to the refined things that we're talking about. So we might be able to set those out as a goal of things that, hey, when you do come back, we definitely you would need this level of stuff to show to the council that we're treating cars and bikes and pedestrians on an equal footing. But ultimately, we have to think about bounding our work here by what's necessary for us to be able to decide the grade separation discussion, and then we could still give advice later on what the further refinements would be. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So
I was going to just reiterate that, and I definitely agree with you, Nadia. I do think, since this topic came up before, the question of are we paying sufficient attention to the bikes and peds versus the vehicles, I think is an important issue to be clear on, and I would really reiterate what Nadia just described. And I think that it's really within the context of making the grade separation choice that, as Gary has pointed out, there are multiple ways to design, whether it be here, the Embarcadero Alma interchange, or for lack of a better term, in order to accomplish exactly that. And so the question is, how far do you take that at this point in time, or how far do you need to take that at this point in time in order to support the decision on the grade separation? And that's where, our scope, and quite frankly, the scope that we set AECOM and the Hexagon team off was, I'll use it in terms of dollars, to get us the plus or minus the $100 million questions, as opposed to the variables that Gary's referring to, which are in the tens of millions potentially, in order to ensure that the design provides sufficient clarity and functionality at the pedestrian and bicycle scale.
Then I think I would say that I would want to know if the mitigations that are required for cars to reach a D or E level of service preclude any turning movements, if you want to call them that, any routes by pedestrians and bicyclists, and that's like really what would help me decide.
Well, they don't, but let us illustrate that for you, because, I agree that we haven't illustrated it the way that, to give you that information that you're looking for. So to continue, the next question is, can you provide total increases instead of percents? So there's a table in here, you can look at it on your own time and see if that sparks any additional questions. But I wasn't planning to actually go through the table, but it just shows the added traffic at a number of intersections in the AM and PM peak hour with the Churchill closure compared to the existing volume and the percentage increase. So I'm going to go on to the question about feasibility. Can induced demand be modeled? It's from you, Keith. And I said, probably, but this question needs expansion. Induced demand from what and induced demand where?
It comes down to, can we model the psychology of humans well enough to understand that if you open something up or make it a little faster, how many more people will use that faster route? Is that,
we can take it.
Is it the error bars on that huge and you can guess what it is, but you can't predict with any accuracy?
We can give you a range, I would say, with fair accuracy, but within that range, no, because we're talking about little microclimates. How many cars are going to drive on this road? And it's very hard to predict. But what we could say is, well, if everyone drove on this road, it would be this. And if no one drove on the road, it would be this. And then, put some sort of bounds on it, because it's not, we can provide some information. It's not like we can't say anything. For example, you might.
In Churchill, there's concern that will Churchill become even more of a madhouse than it is right now?
Well, here's an example of what we could do. I'm just thinking out loud here,
Yeah.
right? Is right now the delay at Churchill is, I don't know what it is. Let's say it's, 60 seconds. And if you do this, some improvement, it'll be 30 seconds. How many more cars can go on Churchill to put it back to 60 seconds? Because you're not going to get more you're not going to get more delay than there is today. You might add enough cars so that it ends up being just the same as it is today. So that's where I say put boundaries on it. I could say there's this many cars now, and, if it attracted so many that it got back to the same delay that it has today, here's how many that would be.
Gary,
Yeah.
if we did that kind of, assuming you could do that kind of analysis, aren't you in effect diverting traffic from roads like, say, Oregon Expressway? And shouldn't that be modeled as a system, as a way of assessing the answer to that question? I'm not trying to overcomplicate things, but I don't want to see it oversimplified.
Well, it would, if the traffic ends up on Churchill, and it's not on Churchill today, it came from somewhere. So we would also need to, look at, well, where did it come from? So where did the traffic increase and where did it decrease?
So I think what you're talking about is what is the new equilibrium point?
Yeah, what is the new equilibrium point?
And that has to look at the equilibrium shifts, the shifts in equilibrium at alternatives.
Yeah, and I just don't want to paint too rosy a picture for the X-cap of our ability to predict things like this. It's very hard, and we have tools, but they're not perfect, and so I just wanted to lay that out there. So we can provide additional input on that question, though. Okay, does data exist to simulate farther than 2030? Palo Alto has approved land use only through 2030. There are models that go past 2030. The VTA model goes to 2040. But the land use in the VTA model for Palo Alto has not been vetted and approved by the city. So I'll just throw that out there. We can do it, sure.
So we could imagine, Caltrain's medium growth business plan in 2040 with all the supposed growth in different points, housing growth and points in the line and all that.
Yes.
But it wouldn't, for specifically Palo Alto, include things like the Stanford GUP, Castilleja, and so forth.
It would include whatever VTA put into the model for Palo Alto for 2040. But where I'm kind of hesitating on this is that Palo Alto, the city staff have not approved that, have not reviewed it, I don't think. And so it's,
Well, isn't there this elephant in the room called the future downtown plan? Which is the reason for which we've detached Palo Alto Avenue from the current scope of our work here. So is there any, if that's the case, and I'm saying if, then it's hard to imagine how the city could go beyond 2030 land use.
well, we're just the analysts. We can analyze anything that you tell us and say, here, run this.
Ed,
So-
could you explain a little bit how the comp plan works and why it goes only to 2030 and sort of to educate?
Probably have a better.
No, I don't think I do.
Well, I think I would simply agree that forecasting beyond the horizon of our comprehensive plan or our general plan for land use would be pure speculation. And so whether it's what happens after the comp plan is built out, or what happens if Stanford or Menlo Park or Mountain View were to change its long-range projections. I think that's kind of the realm that we're starting to enter into. And as Gary pointed out, I think the forecasts we've got are as far as the forecast exists, at least as far as land use goes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just a question on that. So we're planning for 2030, but that's just right around the corner, and this infrastructure will last 100, 120 years. Should we ask council, should we endeavor into this mushy land of not knowing?
I would only offer that the term or the characterization of the future as 2030 or any other particular year is as speculative as how much growth will happen in that time frame. So, I think it's not quite arbitrary, but, it starts to get into that realm. Whether build-out would happen in 2030, 2035, 2040, I think is again, the variables that we're really talking about.
I'd also like to offer the idea that the infrastructure that we put into place will influence land use. So land use is not going to happen in a vacuum, isolated from the environment in which it's supposed to happen. So it might call a self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever, but there's a hard problem. I mean, Gary, you're the analyst, but you write, it's the right issue. What do you want me to analyze? And the answer is, I don't think we know beyond the data that we have.
Well, let me, my opinion here, simplify the discussion by saying the problems that we're dealing with exist today, even if there's no growth at all in the future. So you can go out today and see what problems are happening in the corridor and with the crossings and so forth. And so I'm not really sure whether we're going to see a problem in the future that doesn't already exist to a certain extent today. It's just going to get worse in the future with, say, more trains or more growth, whether the growth is in Palo Alto or at Stanford or one of your neighboring cities. That's my opinion. I think we'd be having the same discussion just based on existing traffic volumes. So let's, next question is, what about construction? Traffic impacts during construction. We have not analyzed any traffic impacts during construction, but we could. So there we go. Okay, Nadia, you're going to have to help me on this one, because is it possible to show network delay estimates? Best way
Yeah.
to represent how they impact the system. And I said, the transportation demand model can be used to study network-wide operations, but I'm not exactly clear what you want to see.
So I'm actually echoing at a very early meeting when we actually had Billy Riggs from the Planning and Transportation Commission before Kerry ended up taking his spot. He talked about the fact that there's network maps that one could create that would sort of explain how the general flows and how putting grade separations in different places and stuff would change kind of traffic system-wide. And he talked about that, and then he talked about multimodal LOS, and that there's different ways to show not just the car numbers, but the bike numbers and the pedestrian numbers. And so that was my best attempt to try to say what he was saying, but I can't claim to know or understand what those look like because I've never seen a network map of that type. Maybe you have.
Yes, I have. And we can show you a network map of the motor vehicle traffic. I can't show you a network, well, I can show you a network map of bikes, of the bicycle and pedestrian network, but I don't have counts of bicycles and pedestrians on that network. So, but for the cars, or the motor vehicles, we can show a map that's, of the city and shows all the roads, and it shows the volume, it can show the volume on each road. It can show how the volume changes if you do a grade separation or if you don't. We can show things like that. It's, you might be a little disappointed in what you see. Just let me tell you that, because it's very hard sometimes to discern the changes on those things because you don't see a whole lot of change.
I think the question, because if I remember when he was around, the conversation was around Embarcadero and El Camino and the Churchill area. So it was really just about that sort of more bounded segment and how system-wide what would happen. If you close Churchill, then what happens at Embarcadero, and not just what you've pointed out, which is the specific mitigations that would be necessary, but really understanding from a larger map view, pulling out the lens, what that looks like. And it's not necessarily the entire city. I don't think that it would be useful for Charleston and Meadow, at least.
Okay.
But
So,
I think
if you've defined it that way, we can provide you a map that shows, the volume went up here, it went down here, that kind of thing. We can do that.
Having said that, I will also then counteract what I just said of my own, which is I don't know so it'd be good to know, but it sounds like it may not be the make or break in terms of deciding what to do at Churchill in terms of a grade separation. It might be if you decide to do X, then we'd need to look at a map, a network map of Y to be able to then decide future mitigations. So, Tony.
When we did look at the, was it Charleston and Arrestadero, sorry, the traffic engineer sort of modeled it with a video that showed us how much traffic accumulated in which areas, and it sort of was easy to understand that video, that graphic. When you close something, what happens somewhere else?
Yes, though that's one way to show it, And we have a video that we've prepared that we could show you if you wanted to see it. It's pretty boring to watch, but because, we could speed it up, so it was a little more interesting. But again, that's why I'm just saying, don't say, oh gosh, I can't possibly make a decision until I see this video. It's not going to change your mind. You'll look at it and go, it looks exactly the same, because there's not a huge difference, and it's hard to discern. Okay, the queue got a little bit longer, and now it got a little shorter. Oh, it's 10 cars, now it's 8. It's kind of hard to see the differences. So I'll just say that we can definitely do it, and we already have the simulation. We just haven't showed it to you. But I do have some screenshots from it that are coming up.
Yes. I'd like to make a quick observation. This goes back to what Megan was talking about earlier about measurable criteria. I'm afraid we could get lost in some very tall weeds if we don't go back to our measurable criteria and decide which ones are the key issues and focus all our efforts, or most of them, on those criteria, because otherwise it's about an unbounded issue.
And to that point, the criteria says reduce delay and congestion for vehicular traffic at rail crossings, and then facilitate movement of across the corridor for all modes of transportation, which frankly, when you do a grade separation, that sort of happens. But let's see, is there another one? I think the biggest thing is just reduce delay and congestion for vehicular traffic. And so we don't really have a way to measure that.
Yeah, and this points out that we have to have a very productive discussion on what do these criteria mean and what specific questions can we ask based on this criteria. Because otherwise, we're saying, Gary, analyze this, analyze that, analyze something else. It'll be so much fun to look at all of it.
Well, let me just say typically we assess delay based on the intersection level of service, which is based on delay. We've done all those calculations, which we can show you. Here's the delay. But you're going, it's kind of an abstract number, which it is. What does it actually look like? So if you want to know what it actually looks like, then you look at the simulation. That'll show you what it actually looks like.
Well, generally, any new grade crossing is going to be reducing vehicular delay because we no longer have to train interruption, period.
Yeah, but we have gotten a lot of questions about how much. Like,
Right.
is it really worth spending $100 million on? How many seconds are we going to save?
I'm with you.
So, and so that the level of service numbers show you those delay. I guarantee if I show you two simulations side by side and say, watch this for an hour, now watch this for an hour. Now you tell me the delay difference between these two. You won't be able to do it. It's too complicated, and these changes are not that big.
Great, we can move on.
So, okay. Now we're on to work requests. How much would it cost? Impact of 8 trains per direction. We already have the model set up. I said it costs $2,000 to do that. So far, we haven't been authorized to do it. But we could. Traffic impacts of the new alternatives. The price plan without the Embarcadero mitigations, we already talked about that. We've already studied it. We've got some things coming up in just a minute where we show you some initial results. But we haven't studied the impact of the diversion or how much diversion there would be. It's in our scope of work to do these things already. That's been approved. So, and we're working on it. So some things are done and some aren't. Level of service at Church and Alma with the viaduct, Church and Alma with the closure. So we created a table that you might find interesting. I don't know if you can read it. It's kind of small. Let's look at the screen. Maybe it looks better. Is that any easier to see?
Oh, yeah.
So let's look at this table a little bit. I think this maybe answers some of your questions about what are the differences between these things. So this is level of service against delay, average delay, peak hour. The top table is existing. The bottom table is year 2030. Just for the sake of comparison, it doesn't have the increased train service from electrification, so, sorry about that. But anyway, so if you just look at, let's just look at the top table, Alma and Churchill now, AM and PM level of service F, or F and E. With the closure, they would be C. With the viaduct, they'd be D. And with what we're calling the partial underpass, that's Price, what's the first name? Tony?
Mike Price.
Mike Price, sorry. Mike Price's idea. That would be the level of service. You'd have 2 signals there, not one. There'd be one on the east side and one on the west side. And then the bottom table is the same thing.
Sorry, can you, I'm not clear on what the east side, you mean not the ones that are at grade and the ones that are below?
Yeah, there's one at grade that we say is on the east side, and there's one
Okay.
underneath the down at the bottom of the tunnel. I don't call it tunnel. It's under the tracks, underpass, and that would be the west side. Now, don't get alarmed at the level of service F for Mike Price's idea in 2030 in the PM, because that we were trying to get this to work with just one single lane northbound. And that's what this shows if you read the little fine print on the table.
So this is a work in progress.
His idea had 2 lanes, but it would be easier to build if it had only 1 lane. So we tried it with 1 lane because we had high hopes, and it does work for existing conditions with just 1 lane. But when you go out to 2030, you get a level service F, and we tried, and we couldn't do anything with the signal timing so we said, shoot, you're going to have 2 lanes.
Is that assuming, because Alma already narrows down to one lane at the Alma Street Bridge.
Yeah.
So this is assuming Mike Price's idea, but not the mitigation of widening that bridge at that spot?
Right.
Okay.
So the problem is that that doesn't have a signal. It just narrows down. But it's, continuous flow, I guess you could say, if you could put up with the merge. But this would actually be a signal, so it's going to get stopped. And if it's only one lane and it keeps getting stopped, that's where you get the level of service F. So
It's the one lane at
the surface. Yeah.
that keeps getting stopped from pedestrians?
Pedestrians.
Okay. So if there was a bike ped treatment in a different location, TBD where that would be, that could potentially help improve that number.
Well, arguably, you maybe could pull the signal and not even have a signal there if you didn't have pedestrians crossing. Now, the right turns would have to wait for a gap. I don't know how long they would have to wait, but, so.
Well, in
Anyway.
that neighborhood, all of the streets have a way out, right? Every part of the grid has a way out, so,
They could take a different street.
yeah.
But, they have the same traffic on Alma that they have to contend with.
Well, but remember, we're also dealing with very heavy pedestrian and bicycle traffic, bicycle in particular. And the concept that Gary's talking about is that traffic would need to cross Alma with no protection, without a signal protection.
Right, no, but that's why I was asking, if the bike ped treatment was moved to a different
The
location?
same issue would exist. They would.
Not necessarily, if it's an underground tunnel, if you did the Churchill closure where you have the road, the bike thing sink down in the middle of the street, if you had that at Seal or Kellogg.
But it still needs to surface, and that would require either closing, well, basically you need to surface on the east side of Alma. Remember, the concept that had been talked about previously is you basically take over half of Churchill, east of Alma, in order to surface the bike ped tunnel that is traveling under Alma. So the same would be necessary on any other street.
Is the PM timeframe that you're talking about the time when we would have a high bike ped crossing at that intersection?
There's also a lot of, or enough, interruptions from the bike peds during the PM. So,
I would
It
tell you
doesn't-
the suggestion of having an uncontrolled bike ped crossing there
no,
is
no,
not
wait, no.
something we
I
wanna
think
do.
what we're talking about was just going under Alma. As long as you're going under, go under Alma too.
Well, again, but where do you surface?
Oh, I know.
That's the issue. And again, just to visualize, the concepts of the tunnel that had previously been discussed comes up in the middle of Churchill. There's surfaces there, because unlike California Avenue, you don't have a park. There's no public space off of the street itself from which to surface an underpass.
Right, but the surfacing doesn't interfere with the northbound Alma flow, is what I'm saying. So it would improve that number that Gary's talking about, that F.
But it would
But
be-
Churchill's closed in that scenario, though.
Exactly.
Which is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about Mike Price's option here.
Yeah, so if Mike Price's option, we kept the two lanes like the way he designed it, then this would be fine. The operation, it'd be like level service C. It'd be better than the AM, it would be fine.
Quick question about the two
Yeah.
lanes. Is that possible then? Or you just haven't looked at it?
What?
To know whether, to add another lane, because you said.
Yes, it is possible. That's the way
Okay.
he designed it originally.
Okay.
But remember, that's a widening of Alma
Yes.
versus
It does
today.
take a little bit of widening of Alma to build that, and so that's why we were checking it out with one lane, thinking, geez, it'd be nice to do only one lane,
And I
but
wouldn't characterize it as a little bit of widening. Alma is fully, basically built out with no extra space. So I think the assumption is taking probably both, the landscaping on the east side of Alma, the Parkway strip, as well as widening into the Caltrain right-of-way, assuming that they would accept that for the length of several hundred feet. I think, what are we assuming, 800 feet or so, give or take? Yeah, so it's a significant widening.
When you say planter strip, do you mean like in between the sidewalk and the roadway where the trees are?
Yes.
Gary, can you just clarify one more time, because I'm still a little confused. This simulation with the level of service F has there's two lanes, Alma northbound, one is turning left and only one is going straight.
correct,
Okay.
correct. And that was to try to avoid the widening that Ed was talking about. But we weren't able to avoid it. To just chunk through some of these other ones, Meadow Alma, Charleston Alma, Meadow and Alma with all these different plans, Charleston Alma. It's in our scope to analyze all of these. And I did say on here that the Alexis plan, subject to how the geometry is going to work, but from a traffic standpoint, those ideas work. Alexis's idea, from a traffic standpoint. But I'm not here to talk about what it takes to actually build it, the way that it's drawn. Okay, expected queue lengths and number of cars in the queue that can queue at Kingsley. This is where I sort of had the discussion before about how to manage the queues on Embarcadero and with a new light at Kingsley. And so we did, let's look at the simulation. So this is the simulation that I was telling you about that we created, and so it doesn't go all the way down to Churchill on this picture, but so this is AM existing. I'll just flip through them just so you can see what kind of get a sense for it. So this is PM existing, AM 2030, and then here's the bad one. This is PM 2030. And so this is the one that's been improved. If you look really closely, this one has what I call slip ramp on Embarcadero that comes up to Alma with a signal at Alma. And then the queue on Embarcadero doesn't go, it goes about to the high school entrance and not all the way to El Camino. Because when we were running this before with the left turn pocket that I showed you, that queue went all the way to El Camino. And we thought that's probably not a good idea.
And I think the question also was about, so cars that are coming on Embarcadero eastbound and are now making a hard right turn onto Kingsley. The question was around the queuing there, because if those cars are queuing, and since it's only one lane under, it kind of like what happens at Oregon Expressway, if you have a couple of cars waiting and that queue kind of juts out, you make it impossible for that queue to go. That was, I think, certainly, at least that was my, I was trying to understand that piece, because to me, that was the movement I was most concerned about.
Well, that's part of the queue that makes it back up. It's right turn cars and cars are going straight, because
Okay.
they're all in one lane.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's an issue that we wanted to try to alleviate. I thought there was also some questions about, Kingsley itself is pretty short, and can you manage to get the cars to fit in there? And these screenshots don't really show any cars on Kingsley because we didn't really get much queuing on Kingsley on any of these simulations, but we did try it with only 2 lanes on Kingsley, and then we realized it just wouldn't work. We need 4 lanes. Whoops, that disappeared. We need 4 lanes on Kingsley in order to contain the queues to get the signals to work. Then, well, that was the end of the exciting graphics anyway. So we got a question about, geez, we really want to dig deeper on Embarcadero. We have not simulated Embarcadero, and so I said it would cost $20,000 to simulate Embarcadero if we want to do that. That would simulate Embarcadero from El Camino to Bryant, which is kind of the part that we were concerned about. To kind of double check this simulation, the only part of Embarcadero that's simulated is the intersection with Kingsley. So
it's not simulating, we don't really have a read on, if Churchill is now closed and you want to go south on Alma, you're going east on Embarcadero, you're now making a right turn onto Kingsley, you wait for that light, and then you turn left to go south.
That part is all simulated.
That
is.
And that doesn't back up? And that doesn't require?
It backs up as shown. It backs up a little bit, But
Well, in this picture, I see the card queues on Alma, and I don't see, as you said, there's no little cards drawn on Kingsley, so I couldn't really understand whether that,
well, we just didn't capture them on this screenshot.
okay.
This kind of runs like you can watch like little cars moving along if you want to watch it for a while, and you can stop the screen at any point. But I
If those
told,
videos exist,
Yeah.
I would be in favor of posting those, Ed and Chantal.
oh, that's a problem.
Oh,
Because these files are huge,
oh, okay.
and they're not, so we could,
Could we play them on a loop at the town hall meetings?
we could show them real time to the committee. We
Sure, so
could-
they could get videotaped.
We could
and
maybe
people-
make in the past, we've done like a 5-minute, just 5-minute slice, because then those files are small enough that you can actually,
I mean, I
deal with
envision
them.
something that goes really fast and just explains the story enough that people can appreciate.
I'll look into it to see what the file sizes are.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and whether it's something that we show only once at this meeting, but it gets recorded so people can watch it and stop it at home, or whether it's something that we keep on a loop at a,
unfortunately, in order to start and stop it, well, I don't know. I'll have to look into
no,
the
I'm saying,
software.
people at home would stop their DVR. And you just play it and we'd record it and it would broadcast live, and then people who want to go through the trouble of pausing their DVR
see.
and staring at the screen could do that at home, right? But at least we've got,
If there's a deep interest in this, we can talk about the logistics of how to do something like that.
I mean, if the videos already exist and we're not adding to the cost, I would vote to be able to have those available, because there are a number of folks, I think for most non-traffic engineers, explaining that, oh, this will function and this does this, we don't get it. We really need to see the little dots. And so for the subset of people who want to look at the little dots, and if the
Yeah.
videos exist and we're not creating new work,
The
that would be
videos
useful.
exist, it's just a matter of how to share them. So
Yeah,
let me,
How big is big?
Huh?
How big is big?
like, a gigabyte or something like that. I mean,
Okay,
these are
thank you.
huge files.
There is software to reduce video size. I mean, have you tried that on it, or?
Well, it's, yeah, let us look into it.
Yeah.
We're not going to solve that question at this meeting. This is a specialized software that, the files are actually not that big if you watch them on this software, but if we transfer them into some like, a movie software, like video software, then the files are huge. So we have to work it out. We can work it out, though. But I just want to say, there's a lot of questions. How does this work with El Camino? How does this work with the school? How does this work with Bryant? We would have to simulate Embarcadero, so we'd have to add Embarcadero to our simulation to look at all those other intersections. Moving on, question 5A, traffic impacts on Churchill closure on residential streets, Park Boulevard will reopen. I'm just saying this is not under consideration. Local streets of Professorville,
Sorry, just to clarify,
Yeah.
that is, because this is a question I've had asked by the council members as well. So we're not discussing, I know Ed mentioned this the last time, but we're not looking at the Park Boulevard reopening, because the number of cars just relates to the number of folks in Southgate, and that's not statistically significant in terms of, in other words, it's something that could be of interest to the council, but wouldn't necessarily also decide our grade separation conversation. Is that fair?
I'll have to ask maybe Ed to answer that question. I was just told, we're not going to do this. So.
Again, at this point, I think it's outside the scope of the work that's been defined here. And again, that raises a series of other issues on access and potential traffic issues within that neighborhood.
So the next question is about traffic impacts in Professorville. My understanding is Professorville is on the north side of Embarcadero. So other than Emerson, which we've already talked about lots and lots, I don't think there would be any impact to any other streets in there, because that's north of Embarcadero. So I don't know if too many people from that area would be going down to Churchill to go to the school, since they passed Embarcadero in order to get to Churchill. So I guess I could be corrected if I'm wrong in that, but that was my take on it. We've talked a lot about Emerson. There's a lot in the record on that. Additional bike counts, bike and pedestrian counts at Churchill. We have those, and they're they're on here if you want to see them. We also have bike counts on Embarcadero at El Camino. These are from, like, I think 2018. We haven't done any new ones on Embarcadero since then. I mean, well, I think the question was Embarcadero going to the school, so basically between Kingsley and, say, the school entrance. We don't have bike and ped counts along that stretch of Embarcadero.
So question for city staff, when that number, that 262 number, which represents the number of bikes going between 7 and 9 a.m., did we ever get a confirmation about how that tracks back to like the Safe Routes to Schools numbers and their counts that they have? Because that, for residents who live on that street, I recall that they thought that that number was low. I'm looking at you, Dave, and others.
Well, you need to add them together. It's 262 plus 128. The way that this diagram's a little confusing,
Okay,
because there's bikes in the street and bikes in the crosswalk is how they did this.
okay.
So,
Uh-huh.
so sorry, this diagram is just how the, oh, sorry.
So for those of you following along, the blue bicycle shows the number of bikes that crossed in the street on the bike lane. And then
That one.
the blue bike on the very top where it says 262, those are bikes going on the street. Yes, Gary? And then
Yes.
the 128 red bike number on the left side is those who cross in the crosswalk.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the total number of bikes would be the 262 plus the 128.
Yes. Yeah, correct. And we have a lot of other sources for bike counts at this particular intersection, and they all basically agree with these numbers. But 400 bikes is a huge number of bikes.
I think the first time we saw this data, we were not presented with the crosswalk numbers, so I think people thought that 200-something seemed low, but 400-something, I think, seems...
Yeah, the count firm that does this, they keep track of it that way, in case you want to know. You know, the ones that are going in the crosswalk could even be, you know, getting off their bikes and walking across the street the way, you know, I don't know, they probably don't, but if anyone does that, they're included as a bike, not a pedestrian, okay? I just want to say that. So, and then this also, so if we want to get some more bike counts up on Embarcadero, it's not very expensive. I said it'd be around $1,000 if we wanted to, you know, see how many of them are kind of going between Kingsley and the entrance, you know, the school driveway.
Philip, do you know if we have that data already? The Embarcadero bike data in any way, like captured in some other project or some other?
Yeah. Sorry, so the bike counts that we have are really how many bikes are in total are going to the schools. We could go out and do counts, but we, you know, I don't know that we have that data independent.
So the next, I think, question was about unclearable queues on Churchill. Again, this is, you know, increasing the number of trains, keep increasing and increasing until you couldn't get the queues to clear it all. So that's something that we could simulate. There'd be costs involved.
I had
Yeah.
a comment about the bicycle question. I was given this by a community member, which is an existing pedestrian and bicycle volumes that actually includes the Town and Country and the Pally Light. I don't know where this came from.
We did that.
Oh, great, wonderful.
But that's I think from 2016. I mean, that's pretty
Okay.
old. Yeah.
So the data is just very old and perhaps no longer represents reality.
I'd like to think it represents reality because the school's still there and kids are still going and there's probably the same number of kids. So I wouldn't expect it to be a whole lot different than that. But I wouldn't, you know, show you something from 2016 and say, oh, we don't have to do counts. We already have them. So.
So I think
Okay.
rough numbers, we could definitely asterisk that, but maybe something that would be included. If you could pass that out later, maybe send it to Chantal so she can distribute her.
Yes, I will try to get a digital copy or some photocopies of it for you.
Good job finding that. Anyway, a question about collision history for the Churchill and Embarcadero areas. We, as a consultants, don't have access to collision data, but do you want to comment on that?
Well, comment on the collision data?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've actually discussed that with this group before. That's something that we're working on, getting more on-demand collision data through our, SWITers and something that I've got a meeting set later this month with the chief of police about.
Okay, we're almost done here. Please include in footnotes what calibrations were done in VSIM. Just real quickly, VSIM was calibrated to the traffic counts and the queue lengths. So the traffic volume per minute can be adjusted to match the queue lengths. Because the traffic volume changes, it's not a constant flow. So we monkey with that to get the queue lengths to be correct. But we also need the traffic count to be correct as well. Please provide network delay diagrams for all impacted areas.
That's me trying to channel the PTC guy. So
Is that the
again,
same question about, having a diagram to show the flows and stuff? Yeah. So I think you earlier had narrowed that down a little bit to say you want to look specifically at the Embarcadero and Churchill area. And so, yeah, that could be provided.
Embarcadero, Churchill, and El Camino, because I think there's a lot in that area. And I think it could be debated whether, again, this is going to make the difference between us deciding between grade separations. I think, again, if you decide on a closure, then you decide you need to go much deeper on some of these traffic studies, but you have to make that decision first. So.
That was the end of the questions.
I had one more question, which was, so we have a couple of different diagrams of Embarcadero, both in like the delay, snapshots, screenshots, whatever. Which is the one that is preferred right now, or that you would propose would have the best operation?
Well, so this one here responds to the 2030 queuing issue that we were having, to try to accommodate the 2030 volume without excessive queues. So I don't know if you think that's a weaselly answer to your question, but
I just wanted to clarify for the public, because there were
Yeah.
so many different diagrams.
and this diagram does show a little bit off the screen there would be a new signal at Alma and the Embarcadero ramp, and that's how you would make the connection if you were going westbound on Embarcadero to get to Alma. And this actually has a little subtle thing. I talked to our designer over and over again about we've got to slow the traffic down. We want him to make a little, hard turn or something to get onto that ramp. And first cut, he wasn't really able to come up with anything, so he put a speed hump on there. That's what that little thing is.
From a bike ped perspective, maybe you just said this, Megan, I'm sorry, I was reading the next question, but this causes bikes and peds to cross in front of those cars now using that slip road to be able to get under the underpass.
It does.
And that is, I think, goes back to the original questions about the cycle track and some of the improvements that had been planned before on that, and kind of reopens that can of worms on that.
I realize that. That's why he put the speed hump there.
Were there any other options that he considered? You said like changing the angle.
Well, I don't know what has been considered, but this definitely would be the topic for us to look closer at, whether it be, and changing the geometry as well as some of the options for traffic control to actually make it perhaps part of the signal that regulates the flow of the vehicles rather than have it be basically a free ramp. So there's some options as to how that would be dealt with, and
you could tie it into the signal and just
different ways to look at it.
Bikes could go when the light was red. You could have a separate signal, turn it red, and run the bikes through there.
That's why I think even having 2016 data, but giving us a sense of, is it 450 bikes or is it 100 bikes, would kind of help think about maybe what that would future be.
It is about 100 on the northern side.
We'll take a pause for, go ahead.
I have one last
I want to
question.
take public comment after.
Okay. You had this chart with the turning radius diagram on that, which raises a question that a couple of neighbors have asked. I don't have a good question for. What are the requirements for turning radius? You're saying that you wanted emergency vehicles to be able to access this, and that makes sense that you'd want emergency vehicles to access it. But when you look at the price idea in the Churchill underpass, one of the challenges is that width that it takes in Alma, and can we squeeze that to be narrow enough to fit in the footprint of Alma? And one thing that pushes wider is when we make the turning radius larger on that underpass, that adds more space and widens it out. If you're at that point allowed to close Churchill, then no one, including emergency vehicles, can cross. And a closure is acceptable, but then if you instead had a reduced underpass where maybe large fire trucks couldn't make it, that still would be better access than a complete closure. So from a legal standpoint, what's the requirements?
Let me weigh in that. I think it's actually becomes an issue of safe design, the safety of the design, and the reasonable, the ability to reasonably foresee a large vehicle attempting to make that turn. So then, unfortunately, there's no IQ test for drivers. So there are situations where large vehicles can get stuck or in a location that they're unable to get out of. So that's the engineer's responsibility to anticipate the types of vehicles. And again, here this WB-40 is about the size of a fire truck, and the ability for a vehicle of that size to be able to negotiate a turn. And if we had a situation where a vehicle got stuck under an underpass, that would obviously be a really bad situation.
It used to happen pretty often at Oregon Expressway, Page Mill, and going south on Alma, that had trucks stuck.
So that predates me, but what was the solution to that problem?
The solution was to make the turn wider like that one.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I've experienced that, actually. Seen a truck wedged in that turn.
So just anecdotally, that's exactly the exercise we go through with the fire department on things like bike boulevards and in assessing whether safe design can be put in place for roundabouts, bulb outs, all of the like, to ensure that they can negotiate it in situations, again, that can be reasonably foreseen.
Okay, I think we'll break for members of the public to be able to speak. And if you guys want to line up, and you can each have 2 minutes. Do we only have 2? Is there anybody else who wants to speak? If you could just make sure you line up so I know exactly how many we've got, so I can.
As you're making that transition, just real quick, I think Millette and I both need to leave, so just note our apologies.
Thank you.
Should I go ahead?
Chantal, you got to start the clock. Great. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, so this is a question. I hope there's no opinion here, but for clarification, I'm assuming that maybe some others had similar. This was a super important, Gary, the analysis that projected traffic under the Mike Price option versus the Churchill closure option. It's not totally clear to me. If you could explain, what are you measuring here? It's just Alma and Churchill as an intersection. For example, under the Churchill closure, if it's closed, what traffic level of service are you mentioning? Are you measuring? If you could just clarify that, that'd be great. Thank you.
I think what we'll, if
Is
it's
the protocol that we answer
I was
the
just going to say,
questions?
what we'll do is we'll have everybody ask the questions, and then we'll let Gary talk and try to address everything that was said. I think that'll just be easier and gives you a minute, Gary, to jot down notes and whatnot. Thank you, Jason. Go ahead, Susan.
Yep, you've got it. Okay, because I had that question too. I may have misunderstood, but I heard a call for possibly modeling the traffic on Embarcadero, and maybe El Camino. But I was thinking that it would also be really good to have a view of what's happening on Alma, because when you add 2 lights. Well, 4 lights if you add all the lights and the mitigations. What happens then? And what's it like to move along? And with respect to all the lights, I was wondering if it was necessary to run the lights all day, because I travel on Alma a lot, and during some times of the day, it's very open. You don't need a light to manage the left turn, onto Alma or onto one of the roads leading down to the business district or whatever. You don't need that, and you might not need it at Kingsley and the slip road either. I don't know. But then I had another question. We're kind of acting as though a decision to keep Churchill open, a decision to close Churchill would be the only thing that would necessitate these traffic mitigations. And I just wonder if we might also look at doing traffic mitigations even in the event that Churchill is kept open completely or partially. Because there are problems on Embarcadero now, big problems that aren't included in this analysis. And I've told Gary about them, and he, recognizes the validity of my experience. But, just the other day when I was coming out of Town and Country, turned left onto Embarcadero, and then was going to turn left onto El Camino to get home, I had to wait through 3 lights. Great. So I'm just saying, so there's stuff there already, and I wonder if doing some of the mitigations, even if you decide to keep Churchill open, would reduce induced traffic as well.
Thank you. Barbara, are you next? Great.
Thank you. I guess it's a question for Gary, but also for the XCAP, and it's been mentioned many, many times. Why don't we do not just a simulation, but a real-time exercise of closing Churchill for a week or two and seeing what truly happens to the Kingsley slip roads? Because to look at this picture and see absolutely no cars on Kingsley, those slip roads are very short. And you talk about the incredible queuing that's happening on Alma to get onto Churchill. If that's an extensive queuing, it has to happen on Kingsley. It just defies logic that those slip roads can accommodate 7,500 cars. So my question to the XCAP, rather than spending $20,000 to do a simulation on Embarcadero, is to do a real-time test of what's going to happen to Kingsley, both slip roads, what's going to happen to Embarcadero, and how's that backup going to be on El Camino. I think you all should really be striving to understand what's really going to happen. Thank you.
I just want to mention that I went to the council priority meeting on Saturday, I think it was last Saturday, and one council member said that the city of Palo Alto really needs to improve the flow of major arterials, and I think that those have just been kind of just getting worse and worse. And basically, Churchill helped Embarcadero a lot, because about 18 years ago, Churchill was on the east side, it was a B, LOSB. And then with a lot of changes to Stafford, they said, it would go to a C or a D. Well, you know what? In 20 years, I don't know if anybody was here, but it's gotten just a lot worse. And it's actually saved Embarcadero, because all that traffic just backed up. And it's like the boy who put his finger in the dike. It's just, now it's all filled. I mean, at certain times of the day. So I would just like to say that I think the Embarcadero access and the way it moves, that really should be studied. And if you're going to, if you close Churchill, which I definitely advocate for, I think that looking at the way Embarcadero moves, and that really old overpass that goes on Elma should really be upgraded. I mean, if you're getting all these new fast trains and that's going to be working great, we're going to have an overpass that was built, I think, in 1932 or 1936, that no way is up to the grade of what we're doing with the rest of the city and our transportation. Thank you.
Michael Chacon. If there's anybody else, if you could line up behind him so I can be sure. Thanks.
I just have a couple of questions for clarification. There are 4 diagrams here in this handout that are titled Work Request 4, and the first 2 read Embarcadero Road and Kingsley Avenue AM and PM queues. And I just need to know if indeed these diagrams are correct, because they show the taking of 2 properties entirely, in that Embarcadero Road is shifted over, or the slip road, or whatever. I don't understand. So I'd like some clarification. Nothing was discussed about that. And the second is, this is regarding the level of service for the underpass plan. From the last line, it reads F, and I just need clarification that indeed that this analysis understood to be 2 northbound lanes in total, one at surface and one that goes underneath below grade, as opposed to 3 as the price plan has proposed. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Thanks.
Next.
Thanks, Steve Carlson. My question pertains to the Churchill closure and the question about modeling higher levels of growth, such as and the reason I'm asking that question is because it seems like a significant flaw in the process here to not think beyond 2030. And so my question for Hexagon is what would be the cost of modeling higher growth hypotheticals, even though if we don't know for sure what the growth is going to be in 2040, 2050, at least doing some modeling to think a little bit farther out than just 2030, what would be the expense of that? Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to bring it back to Gary, but before that, I just wanted to address Barbara. Did she leave? Oh, she left. Okay, well, Barbara, if you're watching, she brought up the issue about whether we can close Churchill now to test it, and Ed Chicata has said repeatedly that you can't, because you can't cause a situation that would cause a bunch of stress without doing all of the mitigations first. So the mitigations have to be built, and then you could do it. So that's the reason, even though it seems really logical to us non-traffic engineers, that you just simply can't do that. And I think, I'll let Gary, I'm sure, respond, but I think, Michael, they just gave a haircut to the trees in the picture. I don't think it's, if there's property taken for that slip road, I believe it's just already city property. It's not anyone's home. But I'll let Gary clarify if I understood that correctly.
Well, as long as we're on this question, I think the question is about the Embarcadero slip road that's shown on there that goes through houses. So that's not really how it would be designed. That's necessary within the software to get it to represent the ramp correctly under this particular scheme. If you look at the other one, though, the ramp is shown in the correct place. Keep going. Oops. Sorry. It was at the very end.
So I think we should definitely caveat that before this gets posted. Chantal. Okay, yeah, just because that will alarm, and I apologize, Michael, that you were correct, and I misunderstood, but yeah, that picture is going to scare people.
I was afraid about that, and the problem is that this mathematical model, you have to tweak it a little bit sometimes to get it to do things correctly, and so we had to create some space between Embarcadero and the slip ramp in that particular scheme that was showing, in order for the model to correctly represent cars that have to make a right turn, then a left turn to use the ramp.
It also makes the intersection look different in the cumulative ones, right? Because it looks like the island goes much further back.
Yeah. So these are all the little modeling tweaks that we need to do to get it to represent correctly what the design actually would be. So I guess I was afraid that people would become alarmed, and sorry about that. And I guess we talked to Chantel about how to walk that back or something. I don't know. But
give me a disclaimer. I'll put it on
Okay.
Yeah, and I think just to be clear, it seems like you're saying the second two photographs, which show the cumulative conditions, have the ramp part correctly, but the first two,
Yeah.
which show the AM, PM queues, have the intersection correct.
Well, there's two different designs here. The first two are the quote-unquote original design for existing conditions that have a left turn from Embarcadero onto Kingsley. And then the second two are the design that they do not have that left turn lane. Instead, the cars have to go straight onto the slip ramp and then make their turns at a signal at Alma. So there's a different design between the first two and the second two.
Okay, and I think the graphic just before this one then shows actual existing conditions today, which will be helpful. This one.
Yes.
Shows kind of where
Well,
the
yeah,
ramp
if you
is
look
today,
at
right?
if you look at the photo.
Yep.
Did you want me to
Go, yeah, you can
answer
go ahead and
some
answer the questions.
Other
yeah.
questions?
Thank you.
What is the delay measuring at Alma and Churchill? What does that represent in that table? Well, especially if Churchill gets closed. If Churchill is closed, it's only the railroad crossing that's closed. So Churchill and Alma would still be a T intersection. And so you would still be able to, if you're exiting the neighborhood, you'd be able to turn right or left. And if you were going into the neighborhood, you'd be able to turn left in or you'd be able to turn right in. And so there'd still be a signal there. And you'd also, of course, you have a signal for the bikes and pedestrians to go across. So, or because the closure alternative included the bike underpass. So closure would still have bikes crossing there. So that's what the delay represents.
Under both scenarios, we have a bike underpass, two different options. One is the bike in the middle of the road and one is the bike they cross at the light and then take a ramp down. So
this is they cross at the light and take a ramp down.
Okay.
Yeah. We didn't model the bikes going under Alma.
Yeah, I guess why not?
We didn't know that was still an option, but we certainly could model that. That's a good point.
Okay.
Is that the direction it's going, or is that from the side that it's coming from?
Oh, the east and west on the table?
Yeah.
With Mike Price's scheme, there would be two separate signals there. There would be one signal down on the underpass. There would be a completely separate signal up at the grade level. And so we called the one at grade level east, because it's on the east side, and we called the one down in the underpass the west, because it would be on the west side. So that's what the east and west means.
And could you just reconfirm one more time whether this, I know it sort of says it in the asterisks or notes, but this is how many lanes at grade and how many lanes down below?
It's one lane at grade and one lane down below. And what I said, my statement was, you can see that having only one lane would result in a poor level of service under 2030 conditions. So we also tested it with 2 lanes, which was what Mike Price's, or 3 lanes. I guess maybe there's some misunderstanding about the number that I'm throwing around. 1 left turn lane and 2 through lanes, which was Mike Price's original idea. And that would work fine.
And
But
do we
didn't
know
put it
what
on the
those
table.
level of service numbers would be
That would be C.
for both of them?
Don't write it down.
Okay.
Because it's just,
Fair enough.
yeah,
I guess.
it would be fine.
Okay.
We did run it, I just don't remember what the
Okay.
result was.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. I know the 2 options for the PED underpass are still on the table, option 1 and 2. But note that option 2.
Which one is 2?
Option 2 is the one that goes underneath Alma.
Okay.
So that, if you build that first, that kind of conflicts with the price alternative. The nice one about option 1 is that it's compatible with the price alternative. Maybe that's obvious, but you were just asking Gary to model maybe option 2, but if the price alternative gains momentum, then maybe that option 2 kind of goes away eventually.
Right.
And just a reminder, the price alternative is called the Churchill Partial Underpass.
Thank you, Chantal.
And the Alexis alternative is called the Meadow Charleston Underpass.
Gary, go ahead.
Were there any other
I think
questions that
you
you wrote
answered.
down?
Nope, I was hoping you wrote them down. I was, I think you got the gist of what everybody was asking. The modeling of flow. Oh, so I think, you know, I heard that, Susan, and what, in my mind, I think, what I heard you say was, whether there's a closure or not, or there's a price, or a partial underpass option or not, that mitigations probably should happen anyway in places that already exist, well, just generally in the city, right? Even having a light at Oregon and Alma may make sense now. And I think, you know, what I would envision from XCAP, and yeah, obviously my colleagues would have to agree with me, but is that, you know, there's what work do we need to get to the decision of what to make a recommendation for the grade separation, and then there's a separate thing of, Allison had talked about it as mitigations for known concerns, and so one of the things would be like, well, we didn't have this analysis, but if you were going to do this one thing, then we would really recommend you do these other things. We might even go so far as to say, well, we selected this option, but we talked about these traffic mitigations under a different option that we think should probably be looked at today because it would just make the network better. And so I would imagine that those are things that that we might end up having to parse out. Same with a bike ped conversation, because I think what was interesting in looking at the partial underpass option for Meadow and Charleston is the concept that having the bikes and peds in a completely separate place makes things work more efficiently and is safer. And it's actually, if you go back to the council criteria, they have it as, where is it? There's one of them where it talks about, yeah, safety. Provides clear, safe routes for pedestrians and cyclists crossing the rail corridor separate from vehicles. Right? And so the difference between the hybrid and the viaduct and the tunnel and the trench for South Palo Alto versus the partial, or the Meadow Charleston underpass, is that it is only the Meadow underpass that, or Meadow Charleston underpass, that actually has the bikes and peds in a separate thing. And so, Peter, to what you were talking about, if the bikes and peds were to be completely separated from, in a different intersection, then there's a different question on phasing, which I think we'll probably explore at some point. But because if it's at a different location, you could do things in different ways. You could do mitigations, you could do a bike ped tunnel at some other location, and then eventually close and phase those things in a separate way. There may be potential, you know, minefields to that, and there could be really some benefits, and I think it's something we'll have to discuss as we get to that. Ex-Cappers, did you have any other things for Gary? Megan?
Sort of related to Susan's question, I was wondering whether there's a light at Lincoln in these diagrams, at Alma and Lincoln.
No, there isn't.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
There's no light at Lincoln, but at the top of that, there's a light at that ramp, and there's also a light on Kingsley. Do those operate, when they're green for both, or they operate staggered, or?
Well, they would be coordinated. They're so close together.
Okay.
Yeah.
It did occur to me, one of the things that I think Barbara had mentioned in her comments was that she felt like not having any cars on Kingsley was unrealistic, but I thought I heard you say, Gary, that that's just a function of when you took the snapshot in the simulation and you could show that and that exists, yes?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't some deception
Yeah, if you
thing.
watch this, if we watched the whole hour, then you would see plenty of cars on Kingsley. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, Gary, thank you so much. We really appreciate all your work on this. And thank you, Peter, for hanging in there. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Ex-Cappers, if we could take a break now, or if you guys are ready to power through, I think the next thing that we have on here, yeah, let's just go through. The next thing is Ex-Cap member updates and working group updates. So wanted to leave space for that. And then we could probably also have a little bit further discussion about whether, as working groups, we could bite off pieces of this report and think about how we might write those things. But recognizing that Carrie actually had to leave, so we don't have a quorum, so we can't really make any decisions, but we can discuss. And I would also like to remind XCAP members that now is, if you've had any neighborhood meetings or other things that, you wanted to bring up, this would be a good time. And then Chantal, in the meantime, if we could pass out, or you said you don't actually have the draft presentation for us, correct?
Correct. We were taking into account the feedback we received from the XCAP last week, and then we made changes today. So I didn't have a cohesive enough document to share, but what I'll do is email it to the XCAP, probably within the next day or so, and then you guys can just email us thoughts if you have them. Just send it to Philip and myself.
Great, and just to be clear, the updates included having additional information about the partial underpass and the Meadow Charleston underpass. And it will be distributed to XCAP, but also to Mike Price and to Elizabeth Alexis, so they can review and make sure that we got the diagrams correct, if there's a diagram included, to the extent there might be. I'm just imagining. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows it'll be XCAP and the makers, so that we can capture anything. Yeah, for the moment. Okay, I did want to, XCAPers, do you guys have anything, or do you want me to take public comment first on this item, and then we can discuss, or?
I finally managed to get the Midtown Residents Association to send out an email blast with all the upcoming meetings that I wrote up for them and told the MRA why they needed to attend. We'll see.
I also sent it, because I'm actually a Palo Alto Neighborhoods lead. I have sent it to Sherry Furman, so she can, and Annette, so they can disperse it. So it went to all the neighborhoods in the city, actually.
I've been working with Greer Stone, who's the director.
Great, okay. Go ahead.
Just a quick one for Chantal. Norm Mattioni's documents, do you have those in electronic form?
They've been uploaded to the website for last week's meeting. So it just says shared at meeting. Let me double check, because I'm on that page. So for.
Yeah, I didn't quite see it, but I'll look again.
Yeah, so under the February 5th meeting, is the meeting agenda, then there's one that says shared at meeting, item 3, resource materials from Norm Mattioni. And then I just uploaded both of the PDFs there. But if you don't see it or if it doesn't work, please let me know, because I see it on mine, but that doesn't mean everybody else can find it. And then I also have extra printed copies if anybody wanted any. You're welcome.
I did get an email from Pat Lau about, more about safety, and so she continues to have concerns about uniform fencing on the west side of Alma and other issues related to track safety. So I'm going to be talking to her. I think what has become clear is that at this level of design, we're not going to have a lot of the answers to the kinds of safety concerns that she's been raising, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. And so what I foresee in talking with her, hopefully, is potentially having a sort of safety wish list that we highlight ahead of time, so that future folks, when they're getting further down into design, can consider those things.
But her issues are not a discriminator, are they?
They're not, and
Okay,
so,
it's
but I
just
still
that
think
we-
they'd be good to
Yep.
be captured. So, again, Allison had said mitigations for known concerns, so, to the extent that those are safety mitigations.
Yeah.
And
If we're doing a project, we should fix those things.
Right, exactly. So I just wanted to mention that she had brought that up. I've also been asked to speak at the Barron Park Neighborhood Association meeting that they'll be having coming up. I'm supposed to hear back from the board whether that has been approved or not, but if so, that'll happen in March, so I'm going to reach out to them. Chantal, did we ever get anywhere with finding out who is the person at Town and Country to speak to for the business, what's the business community update? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I don't have an update, but I'll follow up with Judy Kleinberg. She had been in touch with that person and planned to connect us, so I'll follow up.
She had said the same thing to me and said if I didn't hear in a week to ping her again, so I think it's time.
I'll ping her.
And then we had asked last time about the school. I know the school is interfacing with staff, but are we going to be able to get something in writing related to what their needs would be, so that we can be sure that that's incorporated somehow in this report?
So the two things I think on that, we actually have a city school liaison committee meeting next week. Lydia's in the audience, so I'm also saying this out loud so she hears it. So that's an opportunity. We always do an update about grade separation there. So one question is, does the district want to have something in writing? And we just don't know that right now. And that would be something that the board would have to do. or decide what format that would be in. And then we'll just continue to have conversations with them. Ed and I have a meeting with the superintendent soon, and we'll also chat about this there.
Great. I know they were sensitive about taking a position on a specific alternative, so I think the best thing would just be to factually let us know what their needs are. And we could incorporate that as best we can so that there's some document or something in the appendix, exactly. Okay, anybody else?
So I spoke to about 20 architects or so. I think, Nadia, you've done that once before. I just updated them on where we are and why we need this review and look.
Great, thank you for that. And like I said, I did send out to Pan, so it should then get forwarded. The way Palo Alto Neighborhoods works is that each neighborhood leader receives all the updates, and then they decide whether they distribute it to their email list or not. So I can tell you that I distributed to Pan. How that went out in each neighborhood, I'm not sure. But generally, it's a pretty efficient, we generally just, because I'm a lead as well, we generally just forward what we get. So hopefully, there's a lot of folks going. I have been asked several questions about what the difference is between the town halls, and so I tried to explain what's already on the flyer, which kind of talks about that the first one is general, and then the next one is more focused on Meadow Charleston, I think it was, and the third one was focused on Churchill. So just know that you might get questions on that. But I believe that the information for all sections will be available at every meeting, so there'll be a focus, but it's not exclusionary.
Yes, like at the previous community meetings last year and the mostly, 2018 and 2019, time is flying. We always have a table or station called Other Crossings or Other, and that's where staff is, and we can answer any questions that are not being addressed in the bigger presentation. So you'll always have someone there that can speak to something that's not technically this focal area.
Would it make sense for Mike Price and Elizabeth Alexis to be at a table to answer questions, since that's the least, even if we don't know yet, or we haven't thought of that, or that hasn't been discussed, so that there can be some clarification on things?
We'll let you know. We're still scoping a couple of things out, and so based off what we put together, we'll be able to better answer that.
Okay. And a question about, I haven't checked the website, maybe you uploaded them, the meeting summaries that talks about any votes and whatnot, things that we've done. Still working on it, okay. But the XCAP email we got sorted out?
Oh, yes, that works.
Yay, you can now email us 2 months before we're done.
I know, yes.
Welcome to Silicon Valley.
And I included it it's so sad, I included it in the meeting announcement for this meeting, saying that it's now working, so everyone, I think it's about 850 people that are subscribed to the Connecting Palo Alto distribution list, and so they would all have received a ping saying this email address works, so yes, please feel free to share it, and you can share general information to one another, but do not talk to each other through this email address.
Right. And I did want to point out that on today's agenda, you may have noticed at the very bottom, we have additional general resources. So Chantal has added the link to the Google Drive that we created that has all of the public documents. So anybody who wants to see all the documents that we've collected to date as a group, is kind of similar to the CARD library that CARD maintains, they can connect to that, and it's public, and anyone should be able to see it just going to that link. And I tried to name it something easy, so we just named it Connecting PA, tinyurl.com. So, okay. So back to the working group updates. The working groups that we had, so we had one based on traffic, right? We had a safety, we had a creeks and water. What else am I missing? We have a Caltrain one, technical, yes. So Larry and I discussed having some segment that basically has to, in describing the problem, also basically describes what is happening with Caltrain, and how to weave that in. And I guess part of the reason I was asking for help from staff is, it's kind of collecting all that information and figuring out how to put that out. I feel like the main part that XCAP is working on is the deliberating part and why we made the recommendations that we made, and I feel like that's going to take a lot of work. But from what I'm hearing, that we're going to have to do more lifting than I was expecting, so we'll have to break up the work more. So I guess the question for everybody is, are there bits where someone feels comfortable at this point that they could say, hey, I could at least take a stab at that, or there's a subset of us that could do that?
feel like I've been obligated to do something.
I volunteer,
Phil,
Phil.
speak clearly into the mics.
I've been obligated by this group to do something, but define what that obligation is.
Yeah, I guess if there's a, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say I agree with that because, and I was going to respond to what you just said, which is I don't think we really know what has to be done. I think all of us would say, yeah, we can pitch in, but we don't know what we're signing up for. We don't know what it is. So to that end, may I suggest...
Be careful what you wish for.
Pitch in lieu. I think we should spend at least the next couple days. Someone builds an outline, maybe it's you and Larry or something. Send that out in Google Doc to us as soon as possible. Then we can kind of look at it and add, delete, edit, whatever, and fill out an appendix also in that outline. And then once we get that, then we can start prioritizing, saying like, what should we do first, next, whatever.
Right.
And then we can assign that to people and see if they're willing to actually
I
do
might
it.
go ahead and say, Nadia, in your infinite wisdom, why don't you do preliminary assignments?
Sounds good. I'm hesitant to, assign homework to a volunteer group because everybody has stuff and actual jobs and whatnot,
look,
but.
I mean,
she can ask.
Yes, I can ask. I can ask really nicely.
I'm getting this really strong sense of urgency, bordering on panic, because I know how long these things take to do.
Right.
I know how little time we've got, and we've got to get off not just the dime, but the silver dollar here. That's why I was talking earlier about prioritization based on what they were saying, but we really, am I the only one who's got this real sense of urgency?
Like you, I've written lots of stuff, and it just takes forever
It takes for,
to type,
especially
right? It
because
just does.
it's got to be written, it's got to be reviewed. I mean, everybody who's been through this knows how long it takes.
Which is why I continually say, let's do PowerPoint, because it'd be less writing.
No, Dave, as much as I sympathize with that, PowerPoint is not fit for purpose here.
I'm only half joking, Phil.
I know, I have a very, my wife will tell you I don't get the jokes. So I'm too literal-minded.
But I think at the end of this process, I suspect we'll be able to sit down, and if someone locked Nadia in a room for a half hour and said, explain to me why you made this decision.
Oh, God.
Okay? In a half hour, you could kind of give them the spiel.
Right. But I imagined that was the part we would write, but what I'm hearing is we've kind of have to write soup to nuts, so now I'm a little more concerned.
Yeah, but part of what Nadia would do in this hypothetical half hours is play back the summary of what we've thought about. We have yet to do any of that.
Right.
We've yet to do the really hard work, which is exactly what brief are we going to recommend?
Yeah.
Which is why I think the part that we can tackle now is the factual stuff, which I think is, what is the need? This many trains are coming, the council voted on these things, this is what we, and kind of the summarizing that. And I certainly plan on recycling from staff reports that.
But like what Phil was saying is, we have to have this thought process.
Yes.
And some of that thought process is already done, and some of it is still undone. But I'm confident that we'll be able to communicate that thought process to council.
Yes.
I'm not confident that we'll be able to document all the evidence behind each of those steps.
Okay.
Well, I would say that we could document the mechanics of the thought process, but the actual evaluation, we decided this on the basis of, that's the hard part we haven't done. And yet that's the meat of the work here, is the actual grinding it through.
Well, on the basis of, to some extent, I think we've been discussing is going to be subjective, unless there's complete consensus, and we don't know because half the group isn't here. And so I've just been sort of like pushing that away because I think that there's a lot that's factual that we can document.
Then my sense of urgency, let's get started on that as fast, and in the interest of avoiding yet another round of discussions, Nadia, you hand out the assignments. A lot of us are sort of interchangeable for some of this documentary work. I could do what Dave could do, and Keith and I, or you and I, we're all more, it's a question of arms and legs, and do we all have Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever? So let's get going.
Okay. Okay, well, again, we can't decide anything because we don't have a quorum, but this is, I think, a helpful discussion, so I will take this back to Larry.
I am strongly urging you.
Yes, no, I plan on doing it, but I needed to understand from everybody else where so what I think
So you've been urged.
the most helpful thing is on the basis of, so I think as we make decisions, I can envision, for example, if we have a conversation about a particular alternative and if we can come to a decision, we could have a thing where we go around and say, okay, well, what was your main thinking behind this or that? And we could capture those so that those could be something that gets written up in a table later, like these were the reasons that came up for the various folks about this particular thing. I could also imagine that if we ended up deciding that we want to rank alternatives, because I don't know where we're going to end up on those, like, okay, if this, then that, but if this other thing, we might still want to have caveats of like, okay, well, if you ever had to do option two, we'd caution the following things, or these are things. So that is going to be a matter of kind of better note-taking as we go along to kind of document what we're doing, is how I imagine it. Yeah, Tony?
Nadia, so you've been doing this for like 14 years or 13 years. So you have this thing in your head. It would really be useful for us if you can outline
Yes, I will send an outline.
the big picture.
Yeah. But to your point, I think it's kind of, some of it is just going to be, depends how we deliberate, how this is going to get sort of fleshed out, right? Because in the end, we can just have a listing of each alternative and where we ended up. But to the extent that we're supposed to show our methods used to determine the alternatives, we're going to have to.
And I think
suss that
by
out.
doing that, we will perform a real valuable service for the
Yes.
council. Because they've got to look at what we've done, they've got to say, do I agree with that or not? And what underlies that to help me shape my response? And that's what the council, I think, really needs.
Yes, and thank you for saying that. I think, frankly, the way Larry and I talked about it was that we really are going to need each ex-capper to elaborate why you're thinking what you're thinking. And it's not to put anyone on the spot. It's really to help the council members and the community and anybody watching this process to understand the kinds of things we were thinking about and why we made those decisions. Because if we all just voted on a piece of paper and turned it in, there'd be a question of like, well, how did they come up with that? I don't get it. And so we really need each person to say, okay, the reason I feel about this, and frankly, you might bring up something that I hadn't considered. It might change my mind, or, oh, wow, that's another reason why I do believe this. And I think that all those things are important, and trying to pick up those threads and notate those as much as we could will be helpful, so that as they're reading through that.
So I'd like to mention briefly something called the Delphi technique, which you can look up on your own. It was actually originally developed by Rand Corporation in the 1960s to answer questions like, are the Russians going to start a thermonuclear war? The key value the reason I'm bringing this up is that during discussion, people will converge, will listen to each other's ideas and will converge. It's probably the most valuable part of what you talked about was precisely that discussion. Why did you do what you do? Convincing each other.
Right. And frankly, it is part of what, as you mentioned, Tony, I've been doing this for a long time. It's part of why I push city council to really have a citizen advisory committee, because we may have all walked in with our own prejudices and our first ideas, but the more time we spend together and sit here hour after hour, the more camaraderie we build, that I know that, you're really trying to solve the same problem I am, and you might have a different perspective, but we're not, people are not just grandstanding and taking a position and not moving from it. We're really being forced, and that's why, as you've heard me say, I would love to have unanimous votes on everything. I recognize that we may not get that, but at least the idea is that we really try, because I definitely feel strongly that the more defined the vote is, the more security it gives the council, the more security it gives the community that we really thought this through, and frankly, the more robust of a call to action it is for them to move forward on these ideas. So that's sort of my thinking. Does that resonate for you guys? I mean, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I just want to caution against the notion we will necessarily, despite what I just said, we may not necessarily converge on one alternative. We may need to say to council, here are two alternatives and here's why.
Right.
And council ultimately has to make the decision anyway. It might yet come to that.
Yep, I think.
And we may not be friends when this is over. Who knows?
But we all would have tried, right? So I think that's it. And I challenge that. I see an ex-cap party once this is over. That's all I'm saying. Okay, all right. Well, let us try to end early and give us an extra 20 minutes if there's nothing else. Oh, Philip, sorry, I see you.
Sorry, just one quick staff update. I just wanted to let everyone know that while, we're talking about funding a little bit and we have some known knowns and some unknowns, we've been looking at, potential funding opportunities, and we thought we saw one that maybe was a potential fit, but after contacting DOT, found that it's not really a potential fit, unfortunately, at this time, because, and that funding was the infra grant, which is Infrastructure for America, which is a federal grant for infrastructure. So it sounds like it could work for this, but the DOT contact advised us that until we select a project, we don't have a chance. And frankly, they want something that's more shovel ready. So we're kind of a bit a ways from that. But potentially there's build grants that will be coming out, and that might work better with our timeline, so.
Okay.
What kind of magnitude of money is this? Is this tens of millions or hundreds of millions or?
I believe their minimum award is 5 million for that grant, and it can be used for like preliminary design and all that, but unfortunately, it can't be used to look at preliminary design for several alternatives. It really needs to be you've selected a project. That said, this specific grant program that DOT Contact advised us that the projects that are above the lines, the ones that are actually getting selected, are actually closer to shovel ready. Yeah, because it's heavily saturated program.
And those that are being selected, what would be the maximum award?
I am not sure, sorry.
Okay, so, I mean, is this just gonna be a straw in the back of the camel, or is it gonna be?
So I think the answer to the question that you're really asking is, are we gonna find one sole source of funding that's gonna solve all our issues? And I don't think the answer is no. We're gonna need to dig into every pot that we can see, and that's kind of why I went down this path, was to look at every pot of money that we can along the way.
Well, and that's why I think once we get to a discussion about feasible, what is it, funding with feasible sources or whatever the Fs are, Keith, because I know you didn't see it, it was an original CAP presentation. We did have kind of a brief description of how other grade separations were funded, and that's where you can really see the patchwork of how much came from the local, how much was the state match, how much was federal, and what the different grants were, whether it was a TCIP grant or, this or that. And I think that'll be useful for the group.
Is that up on the website?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I know on the website there's a previous cap or something like that.
Mhm.
If I follow that link, I should be dig through it? Okay, send me a link.
Yeah, I can also send you. And then I did want to point out to the group that I did share with everybody the blog post for Green Caltrain, which actually Adina writes, that was updating everyone on what the Caltrain board was discussing. And so you may know that there's been regional discussion about a regional mega measure that would include the 9 Bay Area counties. I think it's an 1/8 of a cent sales tax or a penny tax, right, on all 9 counties. And at least from what was said at the Caltrain meeting, that doesn't seem to have a strong support going into the 2020 ballot as was expected. And so Caltrain is now looking at their alternate backup funding plan, which is there's already legislation to allow for an 1/8 of a cent sales tax between San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara that would go to fund Caltrain. How that money would be used is part of what Caltrain is trying to figure out, because the counties already contribute money voluntarily, and so some agencies that are in fiscal crisis are trying to make that a swap for, great, well, we'll take that tax and we don't pay you any more money. Others are saying, no, this is an and, not an or. So just, that'll be on everyone's radar. Phil?
Okay, well, one more follow-up to further answer your question. The entire pot for that infra grant was, for the entire country, was 900 million. Yeah, and also that program requires a 40% match of local funds, so.
Philip, could you talk a little bit about, because you had more experience than we have on this, that there is, my understanding is there's a benefit to lumping projects together. In other words, when we had one of our volunteer civil engineers was working on the Belmont, they actually did multiple grade separations and bid it as one giant project because they're able to attract more dollars. And so one of the questions that Caltrain is wrestling with is, if you had, for example, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and Palo Alto eventually combine all of their things as one big project, it's kind of sexier from a funding perspective for big federal grants. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. Well, sometimes that's accurate. And I think, and that's one of the reasons why, I'm pushing for this to be considered as a mega project, because then it can get mega consideration. I mean, it has more impact when you go to DC and you say, look at this corridor that this project is impacting in all of the different cities and all the multiple counties and all that. So I think that from an impact level is significant, potentially, if it can be considered that way, which, could be within Caltrain's current study.
At the risk of beating a dead horse, this was why I had originally said that we shouldn't cut out Palo Alto Avenue, because it includes stationary improvements, which also from a funding perspective tends to be sexier. So, Tony.
So one addition to our work plan here, I think it's come time to add a landscape architect or someone who can focus on bikes and peds to look at the comfort of bikes and peds as opposed to an afterthought that it goes in because it's whatever space is left over. It should be looked at as a good experience driving through these.
So
biking.
at this level of design, we're not going to have the details you'd need to do that. Do you, and I'm not sure that that would be necessary to choose between a closure or a viaduct, or this or that, right? So what I would say is, if you feel inspired, kind of like the safety wish list, feel free to write up here's things I would think about if I was asking someone to do a further traffic study on this. That might be something that I think you could sink your teeth into, that along the lines of what Palau wants. I think Larry dubbed it a wish list. So a wish list to our future selves in 10 years when they're finally getting to the final things, or however many years. I don't mean to say it's 10 years. It'll be 2. Okay, take your vitamins. All right, Chantal, did you have any staff updates for us? No. No, okay. All right, I think with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.